What's up, legends? Welcome back to another part of our epic series, What If Deku Had Cell's Abilities? Part 8. Before we dive in, I just want to thank each and every one of you for your continuous support. You guys are seriously the best. Today's video is going to be action-packed and filled with some serious twists. So get ready. Huge shout out to Big Teddy G3498, the mastermind behind this series. Let's keep the hype going. Drop a like, hit that subscribe button, and let's get into it. Chapter 52. Not so bad. Izuku, come down this instant. Namuri shouted up to the roof. Don't make me come up there. The feral beast named Izuku hid on the rooftop from his mother's scolding, with his mate laughing at his misfortune. No, you're gonna yell at me, he said while peeking over the edge of the roof to look down on Mina holding her hand to her mouth in obvious amusement. His mom with her hand on her hips looking up at him, and Gang watching on in amusement at the scene before him. Mina held in a wheezing laugh at her mate's words. Aizu, you're making worse out to be than it is. Right, Nem? She looked over at Nem. She sighed and rubbed her forehead. Yes, baby. I'm not mad at you, just at your bad luck at being out in public and always getting into trouble. I'm not upset you helped the kid, just that you ended up getting hurt. Izuku tentatively peeked over the roof until he saw his mother's clear distress. He jumped down from the roof of the police station and landed with a quiet thump. He felt a mixture of shame and anxiety in waiting how his mother would react. He felt immediate relief when he was brought into a tight hug by Nem. The shame lingered even afterward, because in that small moment when he leapt down, he saw the stress in her face caused by his actions. He didn't want to cause her stress. I'm sorry, he mumbled into her sweater while he hugged her in return. She pulled him away and caressed his face. Seeing the clear shame in his expression, she asked, "What do you have to be sorry for? You did nothing wrong. You helped a hurt little girl get away from an evil man and find solid evidence for a drug manufacturing ring to be brought down," she said, smiling at him. Looking at her smile, he told her, "I don't want to stress you and stuff." Izuku was startled by the laughter that Nem released suddenly. She brought him into a hug even tighter than before. "Oh, sweetie, the only way a mother would stop stressing over their child's safety is if they locked them up in a padded home, and I wouldn't ever do that to you. It's inevitable for a child to stress their mother out, and that's part of life. You don't ever have to worry about me. All I care about is you coming home safe." She finished by kissing the top of his head between his horns. The feral boy felt tears crop the corner of his eyes at his mother's words and care for him. He sniffed once before nodding at her words. "Even then, I'll be more careful. That's all I can ask for." Nem brushed his hair into a semblance of something but let it poof out again in futility. "Oh!" Mina couldn't hold herself back and hugged them both at the sweet moment. Izuku didn't waste any time and hugged her and Nem in a group hug, while Nem was surprised for a moment before returning the hug. Gang Orca at the side wiped his eyes from the moisture that built up suddenly, and Kane let out a low howl. He padded up to the three and bumped his head into their legs. Nem chuckled once more and reached down without looking to pat the dog. After collecting themselves, Nem looked to Gang. "Is everything settled on their side?" She nodded to the police station where they came from. Gang nodded. "Yes, Eri has already been moved to a secure medical facility with Mirko acting as guard for the time being. As for the paperwork, it should be nearly finished, but nothing needs their input," he explained. "Good. I think that was enough excitement for the day," Mina said while stretching her arms. "I want to go home." Izuku agreed with his mate, and Nem motioned them to the car waiting for them. "Then let's get going." "Thanks again, Gang Orca, for looking out for Izuku," she said to the large man. "Think nothing of it. I am more than happy to have Izuku under my fin," he said, smiling at the feral boy, who grumbled while poking his arm that was an amalgamation of blood and gore. Mina was also looking at it and was tempted to copy her mate in prodding the arm held together by will alone. "I believe it will be an enjoyable time," he said, grinning even more. The four of them got into the car with Kane lying on their feet. Izuku relaxed in the back seat with Mina leaning on him with their hands intertwined. While leaning against each other, Izuku focused on his blood-amalgamated arm and scanned for everything he had in it. He still grumbled at having to reconstitute the same arm that was ashed at the summer camp. Just about everything was there except some bone and steel that he assumed got displaced in the explosion of his arm. There were probably fragments of his arm still back in the alleyway that didn't connect when he pulled the blood back together. He shrugged at the loss he could manage without it. The arm looked like it began to swirl and jerk inside the container of his will as parts began to go where they belonged. Bone was yanked from its free-floating state into where it resembled the humerus, and then the ulna and radius with bits of bone lining up the fingers and smaller bones in his hand. They soon melded together into actual bones, and ligaments formed between each one. Tendons connected them in the right places, and then the veins and arteries began to take shape. Mina watched from her position, her head on her mate's shoulder, as Izuku's arm slowly began to resemble an arm instead of gore held together by thought alone. There were some sounds of flesh melding, something she had gotten used to with Izuku. Soon enough, the shape of an arm was obvious, and the dense muscles began to string and layer together. They looked like red cables bundled up as flesh began to grow over the exposed muscles and veins. Just like that, Izuku's arm was back to how it was. Mina grabbed his newly formed hand and Izuku let her play with it. She ran her fingers along his smooth skin and pouted at him. "It's not fair, your skin is so nice." Izuku smiled at her and bumped his head with hers gently. "I like your skin just how it is." He yawned and showed off his sharp white teeth. The focus and regeneration of his arm took a lot out of him. He felt Mina's hands pull his head down to his lap, and he lay there looking up at her. She smiled down at him and kissed his forehead. "Get some sleep. You look like you need it." She gently brushed his hair in the way she knew he liked, and slowly but surely, his eyes drooped. Namuri in the driver's seat smiled to herself as she heard the interaction between the two. She felt at peace knowing her son would be well taken care of by Mina. Sure, she knew he could take care of himself, but Mina gave him the mental stability he probably forgot about most of the time. She could see from the beginning of the school year when Izuku first came into their lives how much more unhinged he was compared to now, with friends guiding him in the right direction. She was so happy her son was happy too. They pulled up to the front of the dorms and they got out. Izuku was woken up by his mate's gentle shaking. He stirred awake and groggily followed Mina, pulling his arm. He still wanted to sleep, so he followed his Mina without question to the scent of his room. He was gently guided to the dense mattress, and he didn't fight it as he laid down once again. Mina was about to leave his side when his hand latched onto hers, and she was pulled into the bed as well. With a quiet yelp of surprise, Mina was being cuddled by a sleepy Izuku. His chin rested on top of her head, and his arms wrapped possessively around her as he snored softly. "Oh well, looks like there's nothing I can do," she whispered to herself as she decided to take a nap herself after the day's excitement. She smiled as she burrowed tighter into Izuku's chest. Toshi watched Kane trot from Izuku's room alone. He waited for Mina to come out since he could tell Izuku was practically sleepwalking. He wanted to know what had happened. He could tell immediately when they walked through the door that something had happened with Izuku's different shirt and his sleepy state. His best friend slept a lot, but he only slept deeply when he was tired and used a lot of energy. Why would his good friend use lots of energy on their little date? When Mina didn't come out of Izuku's room, he shook his head. He looked to Kane, who stretched out in the common room to take a nap himself. "You wouldn't know what happened?" Kane perked up and looked at Toshi. He got up and began to growl and leap around until he slammed his front paw on the ground and then sat looking proud, his tail wagging at whatever that was. Toshi could only stare as Kane tried to charade what had happened today, but he failed to understand what he tried to explain. Toshi nodded. "I see, thank you." He did not see but thanked the more intelligent dog than he thought. Kane barked at him and lay down once again. "Where is Kuda when you need him?" he said to himself and looked around in hopes of seeing the animal-speaking prince. He chose to let it be and continued to stroke the Bengal cat on his lap. Izuku felt a tapping sensation on his nose and groggily opened his eyes to see Mina in his arms and looking up at him.
"Zu, I'm hungry.
Can you please let me go?" she asked pleadingly, with her dark golden eyes as wide as she could open them. He buried his face into her hair and held her tighter just for a moment longer before letting her go. She giggled at his affectionate actions. She stretched for a moment and then helped Izuku get up while brushing his hair into a semblance of being neat. "Time is it?" He looked out the window to see the sun just now beginning to lower. There were still a few hours until the sunset. Come on. I know you're just as if not more hungry than me. She pulled his hand to the door. He smiled at her and followed her while holding her hand. They walked into the common room with the regular amount of commotion, having 20 teens living under the same roof. Kaken was the first one to spot the pair and crossed his arms at them. That got everyone's attention and turned to see what he was looking at to see the two mates. Well, look what the cat dragged in. Wanna fill us in on that? He pointed at the TV, which was showing a news segment of Izuku taunting Mirko as a villain was being cuffed and seen by medical personnel. Izuku squinted for a moment at the TV. Oh, well, it started when Mina got lost. Why are you saying it like it was my fault? Mina interrupted and looked incredulous. The feral boy shook his head. It's not your fault, it was Kane's. The dog whimpered and Izuku quickly added. But it was a good thing. The mutt barked jovial and wagged his tail. He turned back to his meal of something the other packmates fed him. How is getting attacked by a Yakuza mob boss a good thing? Toshi admonished his best friend. So there was this little girl. Apparently the bird mask villain was doing bad things to her. And I cut his hand off while Mina took her to the police, he said, beaming at his explanation. The room erupted in questions and Mina kissed his cheek and let him explain while she made food for the two of them. Kaken stepped forward and made a small pop with his quirk to stop the questions and wolf whistles thrown at his old friend. When it was quiet again, Kaken pointed at Izuku. Explain better. Yeah, the guy doesn't even have a bird mask, Kaminari added as he pointed at the TV. Izuku's eyes lit up at remembering. He pulled his shirt up and the same bird mask emerged. Because I took it, he said, holding it up in pride. Ida was about to lecture Izuku about taking from a villain but paused and let the feral boy who saved his brother's hero career do what he wanted as long as it was harmless. He cleared his throat and motioned to Izuku. Can you please explain what happened from start to finish? Many others nodded in agreement at Ida's question. Izuku beamed at all of his pack and began using his legendary storytelling skills. After I got that paperwork done with Gang, Mina and me went around the city. We ate stuff and Mina wanted some pastries, but Kane found a little girl hiding in an alleyway. The villain came and tried to take her, so Mina ran with the girl while I fought the bird villain with Kane. We were great. Kane barked in agreement. What's with your arm? Kirishima pointed at the TV where it was clear to see Izuku's amalgamation of an arm. I'm getting to it. Anyways, the villain touched me with his hand and his quirk activated like how Chako's or Shigegig's quirks work, except he made whatever he touched change. Kinda like Rozu's quirk, but with his hands. My arm exploded, but I put it back together, kinda. After that, I cut one of his hands off and then I beat him. Then Mikimiko came and that's about it. He nodded. Everyone was quiet for a moment before Yaoyorozu asked, What do you mean, like my quirk? Izuku hummed in thought. He touched stuff and it changed. The walls and floors of the alleyway turned into spears and he healed himself. I think it's some kind of matter manipulation quirk, Jairu, playing with her earlobes, asked. That's why you slept most of the day away? 'Cause you got hurt so much? The feral boy shrugged a bit. Kinda, it was just the arm that took a lot out of me. It was like a jigsaw puzzle Toshi made me work on at the camp, but I just mashed parts together until it worked. That doesn't sound healthy, Shoji pointed out. Bone to bone, blood in veins. Izuku waved the concerns away. It's like tying your shoes. At some point, you stop thinking about it and just do it. Toshi narrowed his eyes at his friend with a smirk. Do you even know how to tie shoes? Izuku's eyes drifted away from Toshi and didn't answer. He sniffled once and said, No one has ever taught me. A large tear grew at the corner of his eye. No, that shit won't work on me, Toshi said dryly. His mood shifted in an instant. You're no fun. The tear and runny nose were nowhere to be seen. Are you guys bullying my mate? Mina said from the kitchen. Obviously, Kaken said with a snort. Mina mock glared at the blonde and pulled Izuku to the kitchen where there was a small mound of sandwiches for Izuku and her. She eyed the obvious trophy in his hands but didn't question it too much. They sat together and ate while the pack switched from the news to an old cartoon. It was a peaceful night after the panic and battle earlier that day. The next day, Izuku got a phone call from Gang. He groggily answered while Mina hid her face under Izuku's pillow at the noise. Pup, Did I wake you? Yes. Izuku mumbled, still half asleep. Gang chuckled heartily. Apologies, but we need to meet up with another hero who was investigating the villain you took down yesterday. He wants to ask you a few questions about him. K. Where should I go? To you or somewhere else? Meet me at the address I've sent you. You can manage that, right? Izuku paused and nodded. Probably, he said honestly. Gang chuckled again. All right, see you after school. School? What day is it? Mina let out a wordless groan at the reminder of school as Izuku looked around in search of a calendar that didn't exist in his room, nor did he know what month it was or which week in the month. He could hear the smile on Gang's face through the phone as he said his farewells. Izuku looked at the address his mentor sent him and wondered how he was supposed to do the thing to allow him to find it on a map. He turned to Mina, who was already reaching for his phone. She fluidly transferred the address to the map application he used and handed it back to him. He kissed her forehead in thanks. She laughed softly at his affection and got up with him to get ready for another day of school. The school day ended and Izuku followed the map indicator to a train, and then he walked for a bit until he stopped in front of a nondescript building. He shrugged and opened the door to see Gang chatting with a man who had a centipede as a head. They turned to him at the same time and Izuku beamed at his mentor and walked in. Chapter 53. Sir Cateye. Hey Gang! Izuku greeted happily. He quickly walked to his mentor and the centipede man behind the front desk. Hello, I'm Izuku. He introduced himself to the stranger. He tilted his head to the side to get a good look at the person before him and asked, "Are you one really big centipede in clothes or a person with a centipede quirk?" Gang bopped him on the head with a slight reproach frown. That's rude, Izuku. The man chuckled with a slight hissing undertone and waved Gang Orca's concerns away. My name is Centipeder and it's the latter of the two. It's very nice to meet you, young man. Izuku rubbed where he was bopped and looked at Gang in outrage. How was that rude? I was just asking. It would have been rude if I asked him. I don't know, what would be rude to ask you? He turned to the centipede man. Centipeder stroked his chin in thought and proposed. If I came out of an egg, possibly? He shrugged. Izuku paused and looked at him. Did you? He dodged the large bopping hand of Gang and hid behind Centipeder in a flash. He peeked out behind the man and pointed at Gang. Mina said hitting kids is child abuse and that's illegal. Gang scoffed and laughed at the same time. You're hardly a kid, pup. If that's illegal, then what happens when a kid hits another kid? He asked, knowing it would stump Izuku's lack of knowledge in that area. True to what Gang Orca thought, the question made Izuku scrunch his nose in thought. It's fine, because it's like pups fighting and it's to practice hunting, right? He looked between the two people who should know this knowledge. Gang chuffed a laugh. Close enough, but if you do see kids fighting, make sure to break it up. We'll talk about it later. For now, we have a meeting to get to. It's nice to meet you, Centipeder. He waved Izuku to follow. It was pleasant to make both your acquaintance as well. He bowed slightly. Izuku scurried after Gang and waved at Centipeder. Who are we meeting with? Gang knocked on a door and he opened it to see a blue-skinned woman tied to a standing table in way too revealing clothes, laughing uncontrollably as a well-dressed man in glasses watched on stoically. Izuku didn't know what to do other than watch on in slight discomfort at the scene before him. He tugged on his mentor's sleeve. Hey, Gang? Is this one of those sex scandal things? Should we do something? Gang looked between Izuku and the scene before them, unsure what to do himself. I'm kinda thirsty. Why don't you ask Centipeder if he has some water for me? Please? He gently nudged the young, susceptible man away from the lunacy. Izuku nodded and trotted away as the door shut. He rounded the corner and found Centipeder sitting behind the front desk going through some paperwork. Centipeder, do you have some water? Gang said he was thirsty. Centipeder looked up from the desk and tilted his head between the boy shuffling on his feet and the door where he came from. Of course, one moment. He opened a small refrigerator and grabbed a water bottle before handing it to the young man. Thanks, Centi. He quickly made his way back to the door and paused. He pressed his ear to the door and heard nothing before he hesitantly opened it. He found Gang talking to the well-dressed man while the woman recovered on a chair to the side, no longer tied to the table. Izuku took a wide berth between the man and the table to get next to Gang and give him the water. He suspiciously eyed the tall, lanky man. "Thank you, Izuku. This is Sir Night-Eye. Night-Eye, this is Izuku Kayama, also known as Hunter." Gang took the water bottle and introduced the two men staring intently at each other. Night-Eye was the first to hold out a hand to shake. "I'm told you were the one who fought and apprehended Overhaul." Izuku looked at the hand and back at the woman who had dried tear stains on her face for laughing too hard. "Do you do sex scandal things to Centipeder too?" He tentatively shook hands with the man. "Heh." Night-Eye's mouth corked up a minuscule amount before he cleared his throat and pushed his glasses up with his other hand. "It's not a sex scandal thing. It's a way to ensure people can remember under my employ to smile and laugh. Bubble Girl over there just needed a reminder. Centipeder does a good job making people laugh," he said as he released Izuku's hand. "He said your name was Hunter. How did you come to choose such a moniker?" Izuku shrugged. "I'm a really good hunter. I can hunt anything, anywhere," he said proudly. Night-Eye hummed. "What about a human? Kinda. I mean, I've never killed and eaten a human, but I've tracked one down before and stopped him from being a criminal." He shrugged. "I mean, I could have killed a person before if they had an animal transformation quirk and I hunted them without knowing. At that point, who's to know?" He shrugged once again. The two adults were quiet for a moment and exchanged glances before looking at Izuku once more. "Right? Overhaul was a man I was investigating as he was the head of a Yakuza gang we suspected of producing a drug known as Trigger. I asked for a meeting with you through your mentor, since you fought him, and I wished to ask what he said to you during the altercation." He motioned to the chairs as he made his way to his desk. Gang sat down before Izuku. "Don't worry, pup. This brand of chair is very sturdy." He patted the seat beside him. The feral boy trusted his mentor and sat on the chair before shifting his weight to test it. To his satisfaction, he didn't even make a noise. "Comfy. What's a Yakuza gang?" Sir leaned back slightly and began to explain. "It's understandable for you not to know. They are a criminal organization from before quirks came to be. There are fewer of them now, but a group of thugs under a leader is just another gang no matter what they call themselves." Izuku nodded along with the explanation. "Okay." He shrugged and told him about his interaction with Overhaul. "Well, Kane found Eri hiding from Overhaul. She was hurt and had clothes they gave people that went into the hospital. Anyways, Overhaul came around the corner of the alleyway and said something about needing a new supplier before we fought. I don't know what that means. Then he wanted Eri, but my mate took her to safety and we fought. He was super angry and kept saying I was sick or a sickness, which doesn't make sense since I can't get sick, so he tried to kill me. He wasn't very good at it," he said smugly. Sir looked at him with a straight face. "To me, it seems you were lucky. You could have easily died in that alleyway. One touch from him and you would have been a smear on the wall. Reckless." He shook his head at the arrogance of the young man. Izuku scoffed at him. "He did touch me and my arm exploded. He tried to explode the rest of my body, but I was better. And I grew my arm back and he didn't. That shows that I'm better," he said with his arms crossed. Gang Orca sat back to watch the interaction between the two. He would step in if something got out of hand, but he was sure Izuku wouldn't hurt anyone, seriously. He did wonder why Sir Night-Eye was provoking Izuku though, but he let it be since Midnight had asked him to give Izuku real-world experience that he was definitely lacking. "I did have a plan. Mina took Eri away while I stopped Birdman. When I thought of others getting in Mina's way, I sent Kane to help her," Izuku said loudly, almost getting off his chair. Sir scoffed, still seated in a picture-perfect posture. "Half-baked at most. Why do you call him Birdman?" he said with narrowed eyes. Izuku froze for a brief moment and looked around. "Because he had a bird mask, but it was destroyed or something." He forcibly sucked in the sweat, trying to trickle down his forehead. "Like you could have stopped him. I bet I could even beat you too. With no eyes even." He quickly changed the conversation from his rightfully gained trophy. Sir stared at him with his hands arched before his face. His eyes glowed purple for a moment and then he jerked backward as he threw projectiles at Izuku in a panicked motion. One nailed him in the forehead and Izuku tipped backwards. Gang jumped to his feet and threw the desk between Sir and them at the attacking hero. "What is the meaning of this?" Gang roared in anger at seeing his intern getting attacked in such a way. That hurt. Izuku clutched his forehead where blood dribbled and an imprint of the dense seal that was thrown. He glared at Sir, who was looking at him with a pale face and sweat drenching his face. He sniffed the air and he caught the scent of pure animalistic terror coming from the hero. Why did you do that? And why do you smell scared? Gang, this guy is weird and not the normal weird too. He did grow bone plates over his skin just in case. He also snatched the thing that was thrown at him because it looked neat. I saw what you did, Sir said, his arm posed to throw more seals at Izuku. Step back, Gang Orca. You do not know what he is capable of. His eyes never left Izuku, crouched down to pounce at a moment's notice. It's mine now. You threw it at me. That means it's mine now. Kaken said so. It's the rules. He clutched at his newest toy, which was a hero's support weapon. Gang Orca stepped between the two and shouted, Sir Night-Eye, explain yourself. Why did you attack my student? I used my quirk on him and saw what he did to us. He devoured us both when I tried to fight him. He shivered as he spoke. It's only a matter of moments now. I've never been wrong with my future sight. Gang paused and looked at Izuku, and he looked back at him. I ain't gonna eat anyone. I saw it. Sir jabbed a finger at Izuku. Well, I thought of it as a strategy, but I wasn't actually gonna do it.
Ilikegong.
He's like an uncle, I guess. I don't know what uncles do, Izuku said honestly. Gang's chest warmed at hearing Izuku call him an uncle, but focused on the situation at hand. Future-seeing quirks have always been fickle things. Are you sure you saw correctly? He waved to Izuku, who was crouched threateningly but not currently devouring either of them. Oracle quirks are so complicated. Is yours the most likely to happen? Or what I'm thinking at the time? Or is it one of those that it's gonna happen no matter what, and I end up eating you too? I don't want to eat you, Gang, Izuku said, tearing up and sniffling at losing the big hero. Gang rubbed his snout and got close to Izuku for a hug. You aren't going to eat me. You might be right about the theory of what you were currently thinking as he activated his quirk. My quirk has never been wrong, Sir said, still not moving from his position. Ah! Everyone turned to see a face emerging from the door. Sir quickly shouted at him. Lemillion, help me apprehend Izuku Kayama, he ordered. Izuku and Gang Orca stood up from their position. Mito, Cateye is going crazy. He pointed at Sir Night-Eye. Mirio, for his part, looked at each party, and then disappeared for a moment before reappearing, walking through the door with Centipeder and the woman who was tied to the table earlier. So, let's all take a deep breath and calm down. Mirio led by example and took a big breath. He nodded approvingly at Izuku, who copied him and then released the breath. Now, what's going on? After an explanation from Gang Orca and a calming Sir Night-Eye, tension lowered. Izuku still kept his bone plates up and kept an eye on the lanky man. We'll see ourselves out, Gang said in a clipped tone. The feral boy nodded and narrowed his eyes at the hero who attacked him. And for your information, I didn't want to eat you. You look like you taste bad. With that last remark, Izuku left with Gang pushing him out the door. And I'm going to tell everyone about your sex scandal thing. Everyone heard before the door closed. 15 or so minutes later, Izuku and Gang Orca sat on the patio of a restaurant eating their meals. They haven't spoken much after the mess that was meeting with Sir Night-Eye. Well, it could have been worse. Granted, it was his fault to begin with, Gang said. Izuku nodded fervently with his mouth full of a cheeseburger. He chewed quickly and swallowed before speaking. Yeah, he attacked first. And he can't attack someone just because he thinks something is going to happen. You need proof before it happens. Otherwise, anyone with an oracle quirk could point at someone and say they could do something bad before it even happens. He ranted and snatched up another burger to eat. At least I got a neat thing. He pulled out the dense weight and set it on the table. Gang picked it up and was surprised by the weight. He threw this at you? It weighs at least 5 kilograms. It hurt a lot. It cracked my skull. He rubbed at where the impact was before he healed it. The large hero shook his head and set down Izuku's newest toy. I'll be sure to submit a complaint about this.
I'm sorry, Izuku.
I would have never taken you there if I knew Sir was so unpredictable. But why would his quirk act in such a way? Izuku shrugged Gang's apology away. He never blamed the orca. Probably because I was thinking of strategies to take him down, and he used his quirk at the moment I thought of that plan. I wouldn't ever do that to you, Gang, but it still came up. He unwrapped another burger before devouring it like a starving man. Gang leaned forward to take a burger for himself and asked, "What kind of strategies did you think of?" He waved at Izuku with his burger. He finished chewing and began. Grappling was first, using as many tendrils to stop Cateye. If he had some way to keep his distance, then I would have tried a new technique. I call it ribbon net. I copied it from a ribbon worm that can shoot out a net from its mouth to capture prey and eat it. It had a mild paralytic poison that I switched for the poison I made, which does the same but better. If those didn't work, then overwhelming force, which included a lethal approach in eating everything or infecting everything with my cells. He chomped into his burger and hummed in delight at its taste. Gang was already getting used to his charge's proclivities, so he wasn't too worried about what he had said, but he was curious about the last statement. "What do you mean, infect everything with your cells?" Izuku finished the burger he was working on. "Well, my cells are my quirk. Every cell follows my command. If I tell a single cell to consume and replicate, then there's nothing that will stop it until the entire foreign organism is consumed and taken over by my cells. Then I could just assimilate, or tell the new cells to become something new, like reproducing asexually but faster and much better. Or cloning." Izuku shrugged. "Like those Nomu, I can make them but way better. But I'm not a bad guy. I'm a hero." Gang leaned back and huffed out a breath at the idea of Izuku becoming a biological apocalypse. "Well, good thing you're such a good pup." He ruffled his hair roughly and laughed. "Not a pup." Izuku whined but didn't stop the large hand from rubbing his head affectionately. Gang Orca made sure Izuku was dropped off at the dorms before he headed to his agency to finish his work before going home himself. With a hug goodbye, Izuku left Gang at the gates of the school and went to find his pack to see what they were doing. Izuku strolled in and was about to greet his packmates when they all quieted. "What?" Izuku paused mid-step at everyone's stares. They weren't bad stares but closer to pitying stares. "What happened?" "It's Kaminari." Siro spoke first, crying faux tears for the fate of his friend. "Is he okay?" Izuku asked, worried for his packmate. He sniffed the air and caught the scent of the electric user and lamb. His eyes focused and found the smell of his favorite snacks, or what remained of them. All his favorite snack sticks were eaten and the wrappers were placed in the now empty box. "Aizu, it's fine. We can get you more." Mina tried to placate her mate and keep him from killing their packmate. Izuku's head snapped up and shifted into his hunter's form. He began to sniff the air in search of the one who took his favorite snacks.
Izuku no.
Mina leapt on his back to stop him, but the weight was nothing to a determined hunter. "Help!" Mina cried out to her classmates who watched on in panic. Sato leapt to his feet and tried to tie his legs up with his bulk, but it was impossible, so he clung to one leg to slow him down. Kirishima, seeing Sato's plan, grabbed the other leg.
Izuku kept tracking Kaminari.
Siro began to wrap his body in tape, including Mina, who was latched to his back, and the two on his legs. Without being able to move and the unwillingness to hurt his packmates, he fell tied like a mummy. He struggled and bit at the tape, but it was fruitless. "Kane!" Izuku roared out and shook the dorms with his voice. "Find him!" Kane, seated to the side and watching his pack leader lose purposely in confusion, leapt to his paws to follow his command. Kuda leapt in front of him and began to talk him down. Kane liked Kuda. He was nice to talk to, but his pack leader gave him an order, so he headbutted Kuda in the chest and knocked him on his butt, and ran off with the scent of Kaminari, the snack thief, in front of him. "Shit, we forgot about Kane. He's so dead," Siro said, clutching his head in dread for his friend. Mina felt Izuku shrink in size under her and looked at him. He was pouting, so she hugged him tighter. There wasn't much else she could do taped to his back. Not that she was complaining. "It's okay, Zu. We'll get you more of your snacks." Izuku felt Sato pat his left leg. "We'll get you so many more," he said, muffled under the tape. "Totally," Kirishima said from his right leg. From the distance, everyone in the dorms heard a long howl before they heard a shriek of panic. Everyone but Izuku bowed their head to pay their respects to a fallen pack member. Kaminari the lamb thief would not be forgotten. Chapter 54. Cloaker. With Kane's howl, Izuku found where to go. His taped body was still being held by his mate on his back with Sato and Kirishima on his legs. That didn't stop him from sprouting four large spider legs from his sides that ripped through the tape. There were a few horrified shrieks from his packmates, but Izuku paid them no mind. He began to scuttle out of the dorms to find the thief. Toshi, Izuku's first and best friend, watched as the biological horror that was the feral boy he befriended scuttle out of the dorms like a horror movie. While he wasn't afraid of spiders, the way they ran on too many legs gave him the chills, so he wisely kept out of this one and instead watched with his phone recording as Izuku hunted Kaminari for eating his favorite snacks. Aizu.
No.
His mate hugged him tighter but knew it was a lost cause. She paused and poked him with one of her horns. Hey, Zu? What if I ate them? Izuku didn't pause in his scuttle as he answered. I already told you you can have whatever is mine. You're my mate. He couldn't turn to look at her, but gently nudged his head back against her. Even tied to his back due to one of her packmates' quirks and unable to move much, he still made her blush with his affectionate words. That's so adorable. A muffled voice was said at Izuku's left leg. Mina blushed even more, forgetting she wasn't the only passenger. It didn't take long for Izuku's hunt to come to an end with Kaminari kicking futility as he was dragged behind Izuku with Kane trotting happily beside them at his successful task. Kaminari pleaded for mercy, but Izuku gave him none as he was dragged across the UA grounds in the dimming light of sunset. What in God's name is that? Kaibara-sen asked out loud. Quickly, Tetsutesu joined him at the window in the kitchen. Is that a Nomu? He paused and then added, and a dog. Kendo got up from the couch to see what the two were talking about, and sure enough something was traveling through their stretch of backyard at the 1B dorms. I think that's Kaminari Denki from Wanna being dragged behind. Whatever that is, I believe that is Izuku Kayama. Shinshida said behind them all. Tetsutesu jumped at his sudden appearance. Bro, you're way too big to be that quiet. Are you sure? Kendo asked Shinshida. He adjusted his glasses. Almost positive. My nose is quite good and Sir Izuku masks his scent very well, but that gives it away on itself.
Yo.
Izuku? Ken shouted out. Kendo felt some kind of dread and wanted to slap Ken for getting Izuku's attention as he was dragging Kaminari. The dog and spider thing that was Izuku stopped in their tracks and the dog turned in their direction. That weird thing that happens when an animal looks into a light source and it's reflected by their eyes happened, but it was worse when a large tentacle extended from whoever was dragging Kaminari and then the tentacle bloomed like a flower from hell. It split down the tip in a dozen directions to become a cone of flesh with eyes sprouting at the tips. If they stood next to the aberration of flesh that was that cone, they could probably get swallowed by it like a horror movie. No one moved closer. What the fuck? Ken said softly and slowly closed the glass back door as if that would stop whatever that was. Bad words. A voice came from the creature a few hundred feet away. The voice came from the flesh cone aimed at them. With that, who they presume was Izuku kept going as the cone was closed and disappeared. The four stood there quietly as who they hoped was Izuku disappeared in the direction of the Wanna dorms. After a long moment, Tetsutesu asked a valid question. Was that their dog? Do you think we could get a pet for the dorm? Kaminari pressed his forehead against the floor of the dorms in front of his displeased pack leader, like he was asking for forgiveness from the Emperor of Japan. He continuously bowed in front of Izuku, who managed to stand up even with all the weight of Mina, Sato, and Kirishima still taped to him. It was a ridiculous scene for anyone who would have walked into the dorms at that moment. Izuku stood over Kaminari as he explained his mistake and how he would fix it as Izuku himself looked like a mummy half done. Kane sat at his side with his chest out and head held high in an oddly regal manner. I promise it won't happen again. Kaminari pleaded once more, his head still on the floor. Everyone in the dorms watched on in silence for many reasons. Some had warned him not to eat his snacks and he waved the concerns off. Others knew something like this would have happened and let Kaminari dig his own grave, while a few just liked the drama and wanted to see the outcome, most especially Toshi, who was recording the whole interaction with glee. Izuku, with hands tied down by Siro's tape, used a tendril to point at Kaminari. You shall hunt a lamb as payment and bring it to me. Kaminari's head shot up with wide eyes. What? Kaken cackled. Yes. Enjoying the whole thing, Jairu smirked and said to her phone. Where is the nearest lamb?
Izuku no.
Yaoyorozu exclaimed at the same time. Equivalent exchange, it is only right, Tokoyami said with a faux sage's wisdom. Do you think he'll share the lamb? Dark Shadow whispered to his brother. Tokoyami gave him a look that could convey hope. Hey, Zu, wouldn't it be better just for him to get you a new box of lamb sticks? Asked Mina, whose head was on Izuku's shoulder, still taped to his back. It'll probably be faster. Izuku paused and looked unsure. He looked to Kaminari and his tendril split to show 2 fingers in front of him. 2 boxes. Kaminari wept tears of relief and shot a thankful look in Mina's direction. I'll do it, he said, bowing, and when he looked up, Mina was giving him a grin and mouthed the words "you owe me" at him. He realized he got off the hook and was immediately caught in another. With that done, Izuku nodded at having resolved the issue of the snack thief. Good, now the tape. He looked down at his body. It took a handful of people to help Izuku get out of the multiple layers of tape. Sato and Kirishima flopped off his legs in relief, with Mina being the last to be freed. She still clung to Izuku even afterward like a baby possum to its mother. Her mate was more than content to have her close. With all the tape balled up, Izuku bounced it from hand to hand before sticking it to the wall. It stayed there and he left it where it was with a shrug. He sat with his packmates with a small strip of tape from Zero. He never took a good look at it before, but now that he looked closely at it, it reminded him of spider silk. He might be able to mimic Zero's quirk if he wanted. Oh! Izuku exclaimed, surprising everyone. They all looked at him and he looked at each one of them in thought. You all right there, bud? Zero asked. He was aware of Izuku's examination of his tape and was ready for any questions he had, but he wasn't ready for the sudden exclamation. Izuku pointed at his best friend. You forgot to remind me, as he continued to eye each of his packmates. There are too many things, which one? He groaned out, already knowing Izuku planning something or remembered a past plan. To mimic quirks. Zero's tape looked a lot like spider silk, and I thought I could replicate it when I remembered I never tried to mimic you guys' quirks. Some obviously won't work like Yami's or Roki's. He motioned to the 2 quiet boys. And I don't like the idea of messing with my brain, so not yours or Kuda's. Yaoyorozu looked interested. But it would be feasible to duplicate quirks on yourself? Like Monoma from 1B but permanent? Or as permanent as you like? Yep, like that Scaly from 1B. He showed by example by covering his arm in similar scales to Hiryu Rin. Kaken raised his hand in a motion to stop Izuku from continuing. Don't call people scalies, it's weird. Everyone turned to him with raised eyebrows except Izuku, who looked confused. And no, there were some real weirdos in my middle school. I learned just from hearing their interests. He said the final part while cringing. Why? What does that mean? Izuku asked. Mina, who had yet to let go of Izuku's back, hugged his head and brushed his hair. Hush, you don't need to know. I won't let you learn such sacrilegious things. Then you won't mind if we look around your room or on your phone, will you? Kaminari said, leaning forward and staring at Kaken with a grin. Ida interrupted Kaken from blasting Kaminari for such an insinuation. Back to the original topic. Izuku, you were saying, right? So it's simple to copy animals because it's basic biology. Quirks are harder to copy because there's a connection between an organ and the brain that wouldn't be feasible. Like Ruzo's quirk, I can copy her skin cells, but I wouldn't have that special connection between it and my mind to do anything with it. Unless I dissected her to learn. He stopped again, the horrified look everyone gave him. But I won't do that. Because she's my packmate, it was just an example. He said now sheepishly, after a moment of quiet where everyone reoriented themselves from that and Mina gave Izuku an understanding squeeze. Ida motioned him to continue. He was interested in Izuku's potential at copying quirks. I imagine some quirks would be possible, such as Mina's or Zero's, as you said earlier. Yes, but there's one quirk I want to copy the most. Everyone looked interested to see who would Izuku want to copy. Heigu Hakugu Turu. He fumbled over trying to say her name like a child and pointed at the invisible girl. Me? Hagakure, she exclaimed, pointed at herself. Toshi gave Izuku an unimpressed look. Really? You couldn't say Hagakure? Is that why you are always giving people nicknames? He pointed with an accusatory finger at his best friend. Izuku ducked his head and blushed at finally getting caught. It's hard, he mumbled. Once again, everyone was reminded of Izuku's past. While he did have the mind of a savant in biological studies and an innate instinct for fighting, he wasn't raised with others who learned how to say more difficult words or names. He was self-taught all his life, and Toshi was harshly reminded of that by the multiple glares he received. Toshi accepted the glares and winced at being so insensitive. Sorry, Izuku. Didn't mean to make fun of you like that, he said earnestly. I don't mind. Just embarrassed you caught me is all. He waved it off while feeling Mina's tight arms around him in a show of comfort. The invisible girl, seeing his mood drop, quickly said, You can call Toru. I don't mind if it's easier. The rest of the class added their reassurance of him calling them whatever was easiest. Izuku smiled gratefully to all of them and continued with his idea. At first, Hagakure was unsure of the idea mostly because of her insecurity about having such a basic quirk, and then Izuku mimicked it, she would be forgotten or something the like. Izuku was quick to fix that outlook. But I won't be able to control the light like you've been able to. I'll just mimic the part where you're always invisible. I could try to do what you did with bending the light, but I'd probably just try to reflect it like a mirror. I'm just copying one part of your quirk. Izuku finished with a beaming smile. It didn't take much more after that for her to give him a lock of hair so he could study it. His mate grumbled about taking another girl's hair, but it was all in good nature. Mina still hadn't let go of Izuku's back and was still comfortably looking over his shoulder while playing on her phone with her arms around him. Izuku drowned out the rest of the world as he worked on examining the invisible hair from all angles. He had tendrils consume one strand and break it down one cell at a time to see what made Toru invisible. An hour or so later, Izuku smiled triumphantly at his hand, or where it should be, as it was invisible. It was odd to see where the invisibility ends and normal skin begins, but all he cared about was mimicking Toru's passive part of her quirk. While he couldn't apply the invisible cells to his skin since that would require the epidermis, or the top layer of skin, to change into a copy of Toru's skin when he used it, which would use way too much energy to transform from one to another when he wanted to cloak himself. So what he did instead was develop scales that had the properties of Toru's quirk already on top of them, so he could just grow the specific scales and then he was invisible. He grinned happily as he stared at his hand, which was not visible. His smile faded when he turned the hand and he saw problems. Two issues cropped up. First and foremost, it wasn't the same invisibility that Toru had. It was closer to, say, light imperfectly bent around the scales. When he moved his hand, he could see something distorted. Almost an outline of his hand appeared, but it was hard to tell it was enough to tell something was wrong if he used it in a hunt. The second issue, he could hear the scales he used when he moved his fingers. They were thick and used mostly for protecting against blade and impact. They weren't meant to be used for stealth. If he covered his whole body in the scales, every time he moved it would give away his position. They were fine when he was battling against a foe. Sound would be the last thing on anyone's mind when he fought, but while hunting, a single sound could give away his position to his prey. He pursed his lips in thought and focused on the biggest issue, the scales. Maybe if he switched them to a different style, it would resolve both issues. With that, he nodded and made to get up, but stopped when he felt Mina's arms around him tighten and her grumble. He looked over his shoulder to see her sleeping soundly on him. He smiled at her, but he needed to get his book about animal biology to see if there was anything he could replace the scales he was using. So, he extended a tendril with a pair of stubby legs and controlled it to run to his room while a leash of skin was still connected to it. Thankfully, his room was on the first floor. Sato came out of the bathroom on the main floor and stopped right outside of it. He stared at the umbilical cord leading from the common room and ended on a small thing on legs in front of Izuku's room. It was jumping futility to open his door. It stopped and its legs changed into more frog-like. When it leapt again, it caught the door handle. It dangled there and poked it with a key until it managed to unlock the door. It opened the door and ran inside. Sato couldn't stop his curiosity and peeked inside to see the thing drag a book one slow step at a time. He picked up the book and the thing dangled from it, kicking its legs futility. Izuku gave Sato a grateful smile as he handed him the book he was trying to retrieve. He gave Izuku a smile in return and went back to his spot in the common room. The feral boy immediately opened the book and searched for anything he could use for a medium to cover with invisibility and then his body. He found many possibilities but none that fit the requirements. That was until he flipped from the reptile section to the sea life section. Izuku already knew most fish had scales and he found one perfect mix of protection and stealth. Shark scales are adapted to be used in the water to decrease drag, but Izuku could use them just fine out of the water. Standard shark scales usually have grooves to provide ways to cut through the water without the shark losing speed, but Izuku didn't need the grooves, so he removed them and made the scales slightly larger, just under the size of a fingernail. With success, his hand was invisible once again, and the distortion of moving was lesser. He shifted the scales to see if he could fix that issue, but the movement distortion didn't change much. He pursed his lips but accepted it wouldn't be perfect like Turu's invisibility. As for the noise, he moved his digits with little to no noise. He grinned happily at the successful experiment. The next day, after getting his mate to bed without waking her, Izuku found himself back with Gang Orca. Izuku was more than excited to show off his newest ability to his mentor. "Hey, Gang? Should we, I don't know, have another spar to make sure I'm as good as I was before?" Izuku said way too innocently. Gang looked down at the pup and eyed him. He could tell he wanted to show him something he came up with but was doing it in a roundabout manner that seemed extremely adorable to the big man. He played into whatever Izuku had planned. "Yes, that makes sense. Let's go for a few bouts." He smiled as Izuku lit up like a Christmas tree. He bounded inside the sparring excitedly. "All right, pup. What did you want to show me?" Izuku grinned mischievously and extended his hand. Scales grew for a second before his arm disappeared in a distortion of bending light. It traveled up his arm and covered his body, including his cork clothes. He was grateful worked with his scales. Finally, his head was covered with scales, and his hair was pulled back with a thin dome of bone with the invisible scales already covering it. Gang could still see Izuku from the distortions of light, but when he stopped moving, he disappeared. Gang Orca began to get nervous at losing sight of a very dangerous predator. Yes, he knew Izuku wouldn't hurt him, but his instincts didn't give him an opinion. "Pup, that's amazing. How'd you manage that?" He looked around to see if he could catch a distortion of light, but nothing. He flinched when a finger poked his cheek. The scales pulled back from his face with a grin showing. "I mimicked the cells on Turu to get her invisibility." He stepped back to show him what he made. "I put them on scales to make it easier to cover myself. I didn't want to replace my epidermis every time I wanted to cloak myself. It doesn't work perfectly, but if I don't move quickly or at all, I'm virtually invisible." He showed the distortion by waving his arm to exemplify the light distortion. Gang looked at his intern and just ruffled his hair. "That's terrifying, pup. It's great." Izuku grinned happily as he accepted the hair ruffling. "You called your other forms other things, right? Like Echo Hunter. What about this?" Izuku grinned up at him with his big hand on his head still. Cloaked Hunter, Chapter 55. Guest Lecturer. "Now let's take a calming breath. No need to do anything rash." Gang Orca said, the civilian who was transformed into a large ogre-like being towering over everyone, including the large hero before him. This was Izuku's second patrol as Gang Orca's work-study student. The day before was calm with minor criminal activities. A small thief or brawl happened, but no villainous activities. Today was a bit different. Gang Orca was called to a disturbance on the streets, and the two ran over to see what was happening. As it turned out, the man-turned-ogre found his wife going against her vows and was with another man, his boss to be precise. A boss who was corkised against the ogre man while he was at work, as they learned from the shouting match between the three involved. Things got more heated as the boss insulted and then fired the cheated man. Thus he transformed in a fit of rage. Izuku was currently holding the boss away from the ogre from stomping on him or him from attacking the ogre. "She's better off with me," he yelled with a sneer on his face, and turned that sneer to Izuku when he saw the horns and wolf legs on him. The feral boy was very confused about why he was angry at him, but did his job to prevent the altercation from turning from words to fists. "Don't touch me, mutant, please. We need to de-escalate this situation and avoid someone using their quirk to attack someone just using it illegally." Gang Orca said to placate the ogre. The 12-foot-tall ogre looked at his former boss to the hero. Then he sighed and nodded. I apologize. He began to shrink and inadvertently hit a side mirror of a car. A car belonging to the same man across from them. You inhuman oaf. You did that on purpose. The boss reared his fist back and it glowed golden and punched forward toward the ogre. Izuku stopped the fist from extending completely, thinking it would halt the quirk, but the quirk launched its ethereal fist and hit Izuku in the chest. He flew back, missing the ogre man by inches, the intended target. Instead, he hit a car with a dangling side mirror and crumpled the passenger side completely. The car rocked on its wheels and screeched from hitting it so hard. Izuku sucked in a breath of air that was knocked out of him and coughed as he leaned on the posh interior of the nice car. Hell, kid, you all right? The man with an ogre mutation asked with worry. His hands hovered around Izuku, unsure how he could help. Hunter, are you well? Gang Orca asked, kneeling on the man who hit his student. He didn't let his grip slip from the blubbering man about his precious car. Hunter coughed one last time before answering. MK. With the help of the ogre man, Izuku pulled himself out of the totaled car. Easy, kid, Ogre Man said as he gently held Izuku steady. He regained his feet and made sure all his important bits were fully functional. He mentally scanned his body from top to bottom. The only injuries he would have to deal with were cuts, bruises, and a slightly fractured sternum. He immediately got to work on melding the bones back together and then checked his external body parts. He nodded in satisfaction at seeing no other issues and smiled brilliantly. All good now, he said, stretching a bit. Gang Orca, hearing his pup's nonchalant voice, let out a sigh of relief. Good. I've already called for a police cruiser for him. Make sure civilians don't get too close. Cordon off this section of sidewalk, he told Izuku as he stood the man up. He turned to the ogre man who was still hovering over Izuku. As for you, I will have to have you written up for minor quirk use and disturbing the peace. The large man grimaced but nodded in acceptance. I understand, thank you. He bowed to Gang for not escalating his punishment for the whole thing and gave him the minimum of what he could. He turned to Izuku. And thank you, Hunter. I would have fared much worse if that would have hit me. He bowed much deeper to the young man. Izuku smiled brilliantly and patted his shoulder. He had to stand on his tippy toes. Happy to help. Then he moved to follow Gang's instructions by making sure people moved to the other side of the sidewalk. Thankfully, the roads weren't busy. Soon after their patrol ended for Izuku and Gang Orca, the hero dragged Izuku to a clinic to get checked over after being punched halfway through a car. Izuku groaned like a child and had to be dragged in by the scruff of his neck by Gang after Izuku kept telling his mentor he was fine. The nurse who checked him over was giggled at his pout and gave him a sucker as a treat. Izuku's pout changed as he crunched on the hard candy and walked next to Gang Orca back to the agency. Gang ruffled Izuku's hair on their walk back. You need to be more careful, pup. Izuku swallowed the last chunk of hard candy and looked up at Gang Orca. But I was careful. How could I have known that guy's quirk turned his fist into a ghost fist? He waved his arms in front of him as if he was trying to mimic the ghost of a fist flying forward from his. Plus, I was barely hurt. Gang nodded with a sigh. While that's true, you will have to be more cautious around people's quirk. Luckily, you were able to take the impact of that strike, but what would happen if that quirk had secondary effects? Quirks are weird and as varied as your imagination can go. Don't go thinking all of them are straightforward. The feral boy nodded in understanding. Like Toshi's, your close friend, yes, like him. His quirk is quite powerful and incredible in many situations. So you can imagine someone using a similar quirk for wrongdoings. His student nodded with a hum and Gang was satisfied with the lesson being learned. Enough about work. How goes school? He asked with a smile. Great. I like learning all kinds of things I never thought of. I don't really care about literature, but it's okay. Math is easy, and I really like modern art history. Nem teaches that, he said happily. Also, some special guest was arriving for all the hero classes. Zawa mentioned something about a break or something. Izuku shrugged. Gang hummed in interest. Did you hear anything else about this guest? Just that he'll be with one class at a time. Izuku waved happily at a child across the street who waved in greeting. Well, I hope you pay attention to this guest lecturer. Maybe he'll teach you something new. I hope so. The next day brought 1A to their classroom. Everyone was chatting about the guest lecturer and what they might be like. It was a low chaos in the room until the door swung open, and then there was immediate silence. Aizawa stood at the doorway for a split second to glance at all of his students before walking in with Nizu on his shoulder and an unfamiliar man behind them. Hello, am I a bear, a mouse, or a man? Well, I am Principal Nizu, of course, and I'm happy to see you all in good health. I'm sure you are wondering about the stranger in your classroom. Let me introduce Noseda Riku, a specialist who often requested for their quirk. Nizu said cheerily as he leapt on top of the podium and motioned to Noseda Riku. The man was a little shorter than Aizawa with brown hair that was tied back in a ponytail. He wore a simple white button-up shirt, black pants, and brown shoes. He looked like someone who you could lose in a crowd if it wasn't his eyes. They looked like they were filled with glitter and multicolored liquids always moving around. No one could tell where he was looking as he bowed to the class. It's a pleasure to meet all of you, he said with a smile. Nizu nodded in satisfaction and moved on. I'm sure you all have been wondering what kind of guest lecturer would come in. Well, I'll let Mr. Noseda explain. He motioned to the stranger. He nodded and stepped forward. It's pretty simple why organizations, private citizens, and schools like this commission me to come. It's for my quirk. It allows me to put a select number of people into a simulated world you all can select within my ability. Many use my quirk as a training simulation, and some use it as a break from reality. Kaminari was the first to react by slamming his hands on his desk and standing up. No way! You can send us to the Matrix? There were many similar exclamations in the room until Aizawa glared at all of them with his quirk. Quiet! When it was silent once again, he motioned to Noseda to continue. He grinned at the reaction of the students. Yes, that's a common reaction. As for your question, no, it's not the Matrix. He grinned knowingly at Kaminari. No, it's a hyper-realistic simulation based on you can and think can do, just like in real life. You can't cause time to slow if you try hard enough. My quirk pulls your consciousness into my quirk, and you are sent to the simulation where everything is as real as it is here. You will feel pain, hunger, emotions, and everything else, but you will not retain the injuries. Everything is mental. The only time I've seen an injury transfer from my simulation to here is when there were mental quirks in play. The class glanced at Toshi, but no one held any accusatory eyes, just recalling he had a mental quirk. Izuku had eyes open on his neck to stare at him, unblinking. Toshi poked one eye to make them stop, and Izuku giggled at his reaction. Yaoyorozu raised her hand in question, and Noseda gestured to her. She fidgeted in her seat and asked, "You say injuries and pain will be the same. Does that also go for death?" The room became more quiet than usual. Noseda nodded. Yes, although it doesn't stay as I've said. Psychological reactions will always stick. You will remember every blade of grass that touches you just like you saw out here. If you die in my simulation, you wake up out here. You can also leave early by saying escape with the intent to leave. You won't be suddenly dragged out if you say escape in a sentence. Ida raised his hand and began to speak. Principal Nizu, while this is an interesting opportunity. Why? What does this serve? He asked the final part hesitantly since he was interested in the simulation. Oh, that's simple. Think of it as a vacation. You all have been through more than most UA hero students have to deal with, so I decided to give you all a break, he said, smiling. Mr. Nosada's quirk dilates time. 1 hour is 1 day in his quirk. You can choose to do whatever you like. Rest, explore, experiment with your quirks with no consequences, or just let loose and destroy everything you see, he said, laughing maniacally. Aizawa cut in as his boss kept laughing. That doesn't mean there are no consequences out here. If you do something to your classmates that would result in consequences normally, you will be punished to the same degree. The 20 of you will be all alone in the simulation if you choose to. It's safe. To a degree. I've tested it out already. After that, everyone pushed their desks to the walls of the room and sat close to each other to be in contact with each other for the quirk to work. All that was left was deciding what kind of world they would go into. This turned into a shouting match between the packmates to decide where they would go. I want to go to a jungle, Izuku shouted at Kaken. Huh? You've been in one for a decade and you want it back. He shouted back. What do you mean we can't go to the moon? I want to go to space. Kaminari asked, and Uraraka had stars in her eyes at the mere idea of space. You heard him. All he can create is monsters, animals, and the environment. Do you want to fight eldritch horrors in the void of space? Jairu poked Kaminari with her quirk. Tokoyami's eyes widened, and he quickly shook his head in the negative for eldritch horrors in space. I want a nap, Toshi said with his head down. Yaoyorozu clapped her hands loudly to get everyone's attention. Why not a bit of everything? A section for all of us that we could go between. She looked to Noseda in question. He shrugged. That's possible. The space one will be an issue though, he said apologetically. Unless you guys have a way to get to space on your own, it will be just as hard to access as it is here. Uraraka looked glum at the news, and Tokoyami let out a sigh of relief at avoiding the horrors of deep space. Kuda raised his hand and asked, You said monsters, what kind? Just the typical fantasy stuff. Giants, slimes, Treyants, just to name a few. I don't choose which appears, but just know none of them are real if that helps, and not all of them are immediately hostile towards you. Kuda nodded in thanks, and Kirishima asked when he was finished. You said we get hungry. What can we eat? Anything you can eat normally. If you choose a city simulation, there will be food stores like normal, just no people. My quirk doesn't make people. Or you can hunt your meals. He slightly flinched at hearing the green-haired student grin too wide and giggle quietly. When the questions were answered and the details of the simulation were decided, everyone sat down and made contact with each other and Mr. Noseda to activate his quirk. You will spend 7 days in there, 7 hours out here. If you choose to leave early for whatever reason, you will wake up with the rest of your class. I hope you enjoy your time and have fun. With that, everyone's vision blackened before waking up and standing in an unknown location. Izuku looked over himself and then the others to make sure everyone was there before looking around. They were in between 4 different biomes. One was a thick forest and jungle with trees standing taller than some buildings in the real world. The foliage looked similar to what they knew of, and they saw birds of all kinds flitting around the treetops. The smell of the wilds was strong from there. Across the untamed wilds was a town that connected to a beach not far to the north of the town. It was simple and homey in its appearance. There were modern storefronts with a few homes scattered on the main street. A small grocery store was at the end of the main street, and the beach was picturesque in its beauty. Next to the town was a city of concrete and steel. Towering skyscrapers lined every block, and it looked like any modern city except for the size of the unbelievable building. Every kind of building was visible in just that street, from businesses to indoor water parks. Last, a region with green rolling hills that transformed into space-reaching mountains the farther they looked. Trees and other life were scattered across the hills. The 20 of them stood at the corner where they all connect as they looked around. It's beautiful, someone said. None was sure since everyone was gawking at the environment, and Kaminari was cut off by a distant roar of something unknown in the distance. Everyone spread out and looked around. Jairu plugged in her earplugs to the ground to scout as Izuku and Shoji transformed their limbs to have a better chance to catch what made the sound. Shoji looked at Izuku's newer appendage, which was a wide cone with a large ear in the center and eyes at the rim of the cone. He turned to his arm and did his best to copy Izuku's creation. Took him a few moments, but he succeeded and smiled at his friend. Izuku beamed back at the successful mimicry, but focused again when they heard the roar again. Up! Look up! Jairu said agape, looking into the sky. Everyone turned to the clear sky, and everyone saw the flying creature that could only be a dragon. Yaoyorozu made a pair of binoculars to see and gasped slightly before passing them to whoever wanted a closer look. That's a real mythological dragon as far as I can tell. Closer to Western media than Eastern, but that's a dragon all right. She laughed slightly unhinged. It's massive, Zero said, shocked. Then he chuckled, knowing what was going to happen. That's what she said. Kaminari, Mina, and Tsuyu said in unison. Heh! Kaken chuckled at what the trio said as he scanned the area. That's inappropriate. Ida lectured with his arms chopping at breaking speeds. What? Izuku turned from eyeing the flying mass of scales and muscles in the sky to the trio who spoke. Everyone paused. Mina took the lead. Don't worry about it. For now, Let's explore. She motioned to the 4 areas. This is so cool. She grabbed Izuku's hand and began to drag him off to the town with a massive grin. Let's stick together for the time being. We do not know of the dangers that lurk in this simulation. That dragon cannot be the dash. Ida paused as a Bengal cat strolling out of a nearby alleyway and strolled up to Izuku. Everyone stared at the cat that shouldn't be there. The way it went up to Izuku was the same way the Bengal cat did in the real world. Izuku picked the cat up and lifted her to eye level and stared at her for a long moment before the cat placed a paw on his nose and let out a long meow. Izuku placed her on the ground again and she ran off. Well? Toshi asked Izuku and he turned a questioning eye towards his best friend. Toshi rolled his eyes and pointed at the cat. Was Kimchi? The same cat from the dorms. Oh, yep. Izuku nodded and said nothing more. Her name is Kimchi? Nice name. He nodded. Everyone waited until Kaken shouted at him. How the hell is she here then? Izuku shrugged and made an I don't know sound. Maybe she has a quirk? And then slapped Kaken gently on the face. Bad word. He dodged the return swipe and ran away from the indignant shout from his old friend. We are so going to end up killing each other. For real. Jairu shook her head and looked around at their vacation spot for the next 7 days. Chapter 56. Vacation? The pack of 1A was searching the building of the small town section to see if there was anything of interest. They were told ahead of time that there wouldn't be any people there. The only living things in the simulation were them and the creatures scattered about the world. As they were told, the creatures may be non-hostile, but they would have to take a risk in trying and petting something unknown to them. The buildings were bare but had stuff in them from furniture to clothes and food. The stores had a variety of things ranging from more food to tools and camping supplies. This is pretty awesome, Siro said as he munched on a treat he picked off the shelf. Jairu was looking behind the counter and came up with her arms outstretched holding something. Holy hell, I found a gun. The store clerk was packing. Izuku, being nearest, picked up the shotgun from Jairu's hands and felt a faint connection to it and distant music playing in the back of his head. Is it loaded? Mina asked over his shoulder, looking at the weapon. He snapped out of his trance and looked at the firearm. While he knew in big terms how guns work, he knew next to nothing about how to operate one without Snipe's instruction. How to check? He asked like the trance never happened. Oh, I know. Kaminari pointed at a lever on the firearm. Like in the movies. Pull that back and it swings open. The shotgun did have shells loaded in it and they worked when Mina took the gun to shoot it outside. Turns out, she was a good shot since she blasted a weather vane off of a roof. After their celebrations and high fives, Ida came out running at the sound of a gunshot and proceeded to admonish the 4 for such reckless behavior. Ida stopped his beratement when they heard a scream of surprise and cursing coming from between 2 buildings nearby. The 5 sprinted off to find what made the sound and found Sato throwing a small green humanoid creature off of his face. It was bald with a long nose and sharp teeth. The creature landed with a thump and rolled over until it was back on its feet and charging at Sato with a feral gleam in its eye. It was all naked except for a loincloth covering itself. That's a goblin. Kaminari pointed at the thing. Izuku intercepted the charging goblin and grabbed it by the back of its neck. He predicted it would try and claw at his hand and he grew carapace armor around his hand and wrist. He picked it up and looked at it in curiosity. So it's a monster like that guy said? Jairu gave a SOSO motion with her hand. Usually, sometimes in fantasy stories, they are just like anyone else. But sometimes they are like a plague. She kept her eyes roaming the alleyway just in case there were more. Please calm yourself, we mean you no harm. Ida tried to be diplomatic, but the goblin kept on thrashing like a wild animal and clawing at Izuku's hand to no effect. The ruckus drew the rest of 1A to them. Yaoyorozu created a bandage for Sato's arm where he was clawed by the feral creature. What should we do with it? Siro asked the question on everyone's mind. I could kill it? Nosa said there are only monsters and wild creatures, except the cat. Izuku said casually as he held the feral creature aloft. Most everyone got uneasy at that. Izuku saw an issue immediately and frowned a bit. He addressed it before anyone got killed. This isn't the real world. While you guys can get hurt and die here, it's not real. Back home, you don't have to worry about life and death battles like this. He motioned to the goblin still thrashing. But people instead, people are predictable. Animals aren't, not most of the time. I only kill to eat or defend myself, and I do it quickly. You guys aren't used to it, but you might have to if we could find something like this here. I don't want to see you guys hurt. He finished by looking at everyone in the eye. The pack stayed quiet for a moment as they digested the words from their pack leader, and they knew them to be true. While the simulation could be a break from the League of Villains and all the stress hero students brought, it was also wrought with danger. Just like Izuku said, they could still get hurt and die in the simulation. Yaoyorozu was the first to break the silence. He's right, we got this opportunity to do whatever we like. If that means we have to kill fantasy creatures in a simulation, so be it. She looked around to see what the other had to say. The class began to nod along to her words, but many still looked uneasy at the idea but looked resolved nonetheless. Izuku beamed at them, seeing they understood the situation. Great! Who wants to kill it? He thrust the screaming and thrashing goblin in front of him. The pack walked out of the alleyway complaining and whipping purple gore off of themselves. One especially was covered in the innards of the creature, Kaken. He decided to take the first kill and proceeded to blast the creature to oblivion, only to spatter bits and pieces of it on the alleyway walls, floor, and everyone in it. It made no sense how that creature had so much viscera inside such a small body. You just had to blast it like it was a 6-inch steel wall, didn't you? Toshi grumbled as he picked bits and pieces off of himself. Why is there so much of it? Kaken yelled in fury. That thing was 50 pounds wet. He was scrapping his arms to get rid of the gore. Ida was calmly wiping his glasses on his tie. It's possible that the simulation has some bugs similar to computers? Izuku was stripping his top shirt off and using it to wipe his face clean. He spat to the side and made a face. You tasted it, didn't you? He nodded at Mina's question. Well, now we know not to eat them. She tried to placate her mate as he purged his taste buds from his tongue. Toshi finished combing his hair for bits of goblin and walked up to his best friend. Yozu, give me something to fight with. I'm practically useless if something bigger than a dog comes around. He turned to the similar inoffensive quirk user that was Hagakure. What about you, Hagakure? Shinso does make a good point. I can create weapons for everyone that needs one, Yaoyorozu said, and created a spear with a razor-tip edge that gleamed in the sun. Hagakure clothes shifted from side to side in apparent indecisiveness. I'm not sure, maybe daggers? Something like that would work with my style. She was handed over punch daggers and sheaths for them. Oh, these are nice, she said, admiring the weapons. Toshi took the knife Izuku made for him and nodded in thanks. Jairu held a machete, Kaminari an all-metal spear, and Uraraka a slingshot. All were created by Yaoyorozu. The rest of the pack forwent weapons and relied on their quirks instead. From there, the group split up into groups that wanted to explore parts of the world they would be in for the next week. Mina and Izuku stuck together with Jairu, Shoji, and Toshi joining them in walking around the simulation. Some of their packs split off to look at the metropolis and others headed to the rolling hills. No one wanted to go to the thick forest just yet. They all decided to meet up once again when the sun began to set in the town for dinner and sleep. The first thing Izuku's first friend group noticed about the ocean was that it also had monsters in it. Granted, they were in the deep parts of the ocean, but when a fin the size of their dorms broke the waterline, it made little difference for their choice in taking a dip. Izuku was tempted to leap into the ocean head first and hunt. But reason won out. Izuku was sure he could win with most animals back home since he knew so much about their weak points and biology. But monsters? They were unknown, and his monkey brain said danger and danger bad. So he restrained himself for now. Even with the waters most likely infested with leviathans and other unknown creatures, the beach was picturesque in its beauty. The waves lapped the sand in a rhythmic tempo that would put anyone to sleep. Toshi wanted to take a nap right there and then, but he was reminded that even if the beach looked nice, it wasn't safe. That danger was punctuated by an explosion in the distance they all recognized belonged to their resident bomber. The five of them looked at each other and then looked back to where the explosion came from. I'll take a look, Izuku said as his wings burst from his back and he leaped into the air with all the force he had. Be careful, Toshi yelled up at him. Izuku flapped his wings and they brought him higher and higher. His balance was off, so he grew his tail like he usually had when flying to help him maintain his stability. He was high in the sky when he stopped and hovered to see if he could catch a glimpse of what Kaken was blowing up. His eyes were already modified to be as keen as a hawk, so he could see some of what was happening. Kaken was battling against some large humanoid creature that reminded him of the ogre man from the day before with Gang Orca. He could see a sheen of red hair that was most likely Kirishima helping him in battle, and Siro with the strips of white covering the creature's legs. He heard shouting from below and looked down in worry to see his pack being attacked, but he was confused when they were waving their arms and pointing up. When he turned to see what they were pointing at, he was knocked out of the sky by something massive. He never heard the wings flapping of the creature since it was in a dive aimed at him, but he heard them now as the two beasts battled in the sky. He heard a screech right next to his head and the hot breath of the beast. He couldn't get a good look at it other than seeing feathers, a beak, and clawed paws like a lion. Izuku didn't care what attacked him, only that something was attacking him and the claws were gouging into his body. He roared in challenge and pain as he returned the favor by lashing his tail and striking the wing. It penetrated through bone and flesh and anchored itself as he clawed and bit the bird-lion thing. The two began to spiral to the ground, locked together in a death grip. The two beasts continued to claw and bite at each other as they got closer and closer to the ground. The sky rained red with their blood. Mina watched in worry and panic as her mate fell from the sky entangled with what she could tell was a lion with a bird head and wings. She could tell immediately that she couldn't do anything other than hope Izuku would be all right, even if it was a simulation. The sands were dotted red from their blood raining down, and then they crashed into the sands themselves. Izuku maneuvered the lion to land on its back as he used it to cushion his fall from the terminal velocity. She flinched at hearing bones break and other unpleasant sounds. But to her relief, Izuku was alive and still fighting like a wild animal. He tore into the lion with claw and fang until he managed to get a grip on the bird's head, viciously twisted, and pulled with a roar of pure primal fury. The bird lion's convulsing body lay torn apart as Izuku stood on top of it. He turned to them with huffing breaths and yanked his spear-tipped tail out of the creature as his deep wounds sealed closed. His wings closed the few tears on them, and he closed them in his back. "I won," Izuku said proudly with a smile that showed the blood on his teeth. He spat to the side and a few feathers flew out of his mouth. Toshi shook his head. "What the fuck, Izuku?" He looked up in case there were more of those creatures. He got the obligatory chastisement from Izuku. Jairu just looked shocked at the scene before her, and from the corner of her eye, she saw her friend Mina. While the two weren't super close, she could call her a good friend. So she was a bit surprised when she looked over to her and saw her normally pink cheeks flushed purple and staring intently at Izuku. She hit her arm to snap her out of whatever that was. She squeaked and covered her face as Jairu could only shake her head at her. Shoji and Toshi were looking over at the headless creature up close as Izuku rinsed himself of blood on the shore of the beach. The remains of his clothes were torn rags that exposed his upper body and some of his lower body. Luckily, he was wearing his cork cloth underwear that Auntie gifted him. He decided to get rid of the rest of the rags on his chest and toss them to the side. He joined his packmates looking at the creature as Mina and Jairu talked in a hushed conversation not far away. He gave them a confused look but remembered Nem's important lesson: girls are weird. With that, he let them be and looked over at his prey. "I believe this is a griffin. I've read some fantasy stories and it's pretty similar," Shoji said as he pulled the intact wing that wasn't punctured by Izuku's tail. "Griffin," Izuku said slowly. "So a bird lion? Only bigger, way bigger." He used his tail to prod at the dead creature. "Yes, quite ferocious creatures from the literature I've perused. Fantasy isn't my preferred genre, so I am limited in this." The two girls walked up to the boys and Mina went to talk but had to clear her throat as she squeaked slightly. Jairu gave her a flat look and spoke first. "What should we do with it? Eat it? Looks unique." Izuku crouched down to the front feet, which were bird talons, while the rear two were lion paws. "But its bird and feathers are annoying," he grumbled. The hunter looked at the talon that gouged out deep furrows on his body and decided it was a worthy trophy. He sliced one of the hand-sized talons and used a hair-thin tendril to drain all the blood to preserve it as best as he could, and then tied it to his pant waistline. He smiled happily at his trophy and looked up to see his pack watching him with amusement at his simple pleasure. The group decided not to eat the beast and instead dragged it to the forest edge for scavengers to eat the remains. Izuku did of course take a nibble from both parts of the beast and was satisfied with the feline part but less so with the bird half. Raw bird always tasted bad to him. With that done, they got away from the corpse and made to walk out of the beach area when Kaminari and Shiro came running with panic on their faces towards them. "Ants!" the two said in unison, pointing back where they came. "Ants?" Jairu asked confused. "What kind of ants?" Mina asked. "Like those black ones? Or those nasty red ones?" "Giant ants!" Kaminari screamed and looked at Izuku. "Yaoyorozu needs help." Izuku nodded seriously and leapt into the air. He flapped his wings and propelled himself as fast as he could in the direction the two pointed. As the shirtless feral student flew off, Shoji looked at the two still gasping for breaths from running. "How big are we talking?" Yaoyorozu was screaming a battle cry with a large tank on her back and flames spewing from a gun in her hands. She waved the stream of fire back and forth to push the advancing giant ants back and hoped their pack leader would show up soon. She would have sent Ida if he wasn't dealing with a large snake trying to constrict Sato. Sato, for his part, was holding the body of the snake from killing him as Ida struck at the head of the beast. Todoroki was already doing his best to stop the horde of ants with both his flames and ice, but they just crawled over the ice and there were always more to replace the burnt ones. Bakugo was still dealing with the large ogre that won't go down. "They said this was supposed to be a vacation?" Hagakure screamed as she stabbed down at a single ant the size of her foot. "This is the worst fucking vacation ever," she yelled out as she kicked the ant away. Yaoyorozu had to agree with her packmate. They were told to relax and spend time letting loose in this simulation, but so far they haven't had a moment's peace. She was contemplating creating something to deal with the ants for good, but worried for her packmates if she used such a creation. Luckily, she didn't have to commit a war crime that day since she saw their pack leader swoop down and snag one of the ants before rising into the air again. Izuku looked at the sea of red ants the size of someone's head swarming from the forest. A writhing mass of red advanced ever forth towards his packmates, who did everything they could to hold the line. He dove down and grabbed one of the ants and was lucky that he wasn't pulled down into the mass of insects. The ant he held looked like any regular red ant you'd find in someone's yard, but scaled larger and just as strong as it tried to bite with its clacking mandibles. From his point of view, there was only one way to kill the horde, and he always wanted to try something like this, so he had tendrils stab into the ant to make sure his cells could recognize their target, and then he made something people could call cataclysmic. The ant died in his hands, and then he filled it with his cells. He made sure they would only target the ants, and then he dropped the dead ant into the horde. He hovered there as the dead ant exploded into a small mass of parasites. The newly born lamprey-like creatures latched onto their new hosts and injected eggs that rapidly ate and grew inside the host ant until they burst out like the first one to continue the process. Soon, there were hundreds of exploding ants spreading the parasite to their brothers. The ants tried to fight back, but for every parasite they killed there were hundreds behind them. Yaoyorozu felt the blood drain from her face as she witnessed a biological terror ravage the horde of ants in an instant. One moment they were losing, then it was over as the lamprey things spread at a frightening speed that there was no way for the ants to survive. The parasite followed the trail of ants back to their nests and their queens. She looked up at Izuku, who hovered in the air as he watched the process with the wonder of a child and shivered just a bit. Chapter 57. Definitely not a vacation. Izuku landed softly on the remains of the giant ants and the lamprey creatures he created. At the moment, they were consuming the ant remains, but they are harmless to everything else. So he picked one up. They were a reddish pink with a worm-like body and razor-sharp teeth lining its mouth. It was just under a foot long with a long, narrow body with no eyes. When he picked one up, he felt the connection he felt to every part of his body. Every parasite was still part of him, his cells to command. He stared at the parasite wriggling in his hand and absorbed it like he'd done hundreds of times before with other parts of his body. "Neat," he said to himself. Izuku?" Yaoyorozu called out to him. He turned around to see about half of his packmates staring at the wriggling mass of lamprey and not getting closer. "Oh, don't worry, they were made to target the ants only. See?" He picked one up and pushed the mouth to his arm for nothing to happen. But now what to do with them? The pack of one got closer now that they saw they wouldn't harm them, although they were still wary of the things that took out a colony of giant ants in a minute. Yaoyorozu examined a few of them but got up after a moment and frowned in thought as she watched some of their class run off to help Ida with the snake body on Sato. Hagakure, you're right, she finally said. Hagakure perked up and looked at the heiress. About what? This was supposed to be a vacation like Nizu said, but this is more like a survival training camp, Yaoyorozu explained. Izuku was gathering the lamprey and exclaimed, "Oh, like the training camp." Zawa said it was a logical ruse or something at the beginning. Some of the lampreys tried to wriggle away, but he snatched them and put them in a pile. Yaoyorozu stared at Izuku crouched down with his spear-tipped tail waving lazily and his wings folded to his back as he made a mound of lamprey. You don't think that this was another logical ruse? Almost definitely, Jairu said, coming up to the group. The group that Izuku left behind to help the rest of the pack watched on as the feral boy collected the wriggling mass of parasites. What the fuck is going on? Toshi asked the question on everyone's mind. Mina got close to the mess of ant remains lampreys and everything in between. She did not step into the mess. She dodged a flying lamprey aimed at Toshi, who also dodged in time. Bad words, Izuku admonished. Lots of ants were coming, so I made this. Or one of these, and they spread fast. Now, I've got an idea. Shoji picked up the lamprey Izuku threw at Toshi and examined it. You created this? He asked in slight awe. He placed the lamprey near its kin and it wriggled closer to eat an ant. Are they intelligent? No, just basic functions. Eat and replicate, that's about it. He was grabbing armfuls of them at a time and dumping them in one place. What are you doing now? What's your idea? Mina asked as she petted one of the lamprey as it ate. Izuku smiled at her and then focused on the mound of lamprey. He touched them with both hands and then felt the connection between him and his cells. Every lamprey melded together into a red mass that began to take shape once again. A long body with 4 legs emerged from the red mass. They were skinless with exposed muscles and veins. Then scales grew over time on the creature, the color of dark green like Izuku's ever-messy hair. Vicious talons grew on the feet of the creature, fit for sprinting with no worry about traction. The body was lithe like a dog and the head resembled one until the 4 eyes took shape. 2 on each side of the head with its fanged maw stretching to open wide enough to fit someone's head in it. The tail was a whip-thin thing that stretched long enough to touch its head with a razor tip on the end. Izuku stepped back and looked at his newest creature. The creature got up from his side and howled into the sky to announce its presence. Steam rose from its maw as everyone in the vicinity stopped and turned to the newest hunter. The howl was not one of any dog, but a sound that would haunt a child's dreams. It reverberated across the field of dead ants and lamprey. The creature shook its body and looked around in curiosity. They turned to Toshi, who spoke first. Izuku, what is that? He sounded a bit shaken from what he just witnessed.
This is Skull.
I made him, Izuku said proudly as Skal turned to him and sniffed him. Mina tentatively got closer to them. You made a hellhound, she stated and looked at Skal, who turned to her. She offered her hand to smell and Skal butted his head into it. She smiled and stroked his green scales. Like Kane, I did copy Kane's brain, but it's not him. Just the mind of a dog in the body of this. Skal knows how to do everything he needs to but doesn't have any memories. A newborn, Izuku explained. Need to make sure he recognizes you all as my pack, he murmured to himself. Skal sniffed at one of the many lampreys and then he set his paw on one of them. To everyone's surprise, the lamprey was absorbed just like Izuku had earlier. The feral boy was the most surprised since he didn't intentionally give him his quirk, but it made sense since Skal was made entirely of his quirk. He gave the basic commands to keep Skal alive and functioning as best as he could. An apex predator created by another apex predator. A perfect guardian for his pack. Izuku, why do you look surprised? Toshi asked his best friend. I didn't expect Skal to be able to do that, Izuku said as he watched Skal wander around as he got used to his environment. I wonder what else he can do. Toshi brushed his hair back, not knowing what to say to what Izuku just created. What else can he do, he says. He whispered to himself. He felt a pat on the shoulder and turned to see Shoji giving him a comforting look. It didn't take long before the rest of the class gathered around the ant massacre and Izuku. They all stared at what they could only guess was something Izuku created as Scal looked at all 19 students. A short explanation later, everyone was caught up as to why Izuku created Scal. While the simulation was supposed to be some sort of vacation for them all, obviously that was false since they haven't had a moment's peace due to all the monsters. So he created something to help his pack survive the vacation they were on. Izuku had Scal's attention as he spoke. "They are my pack, my family, and your pack now," he said, pointing at the 19 surprised teenagers. "Packmates do not hurt each other," he said intensely as he stared into Scal's 4 eyes. His wings slightly opened to make him larger, and his second pair of eyes opened to stare at Scal until he understood. His presence was focused on Scal just for a moment to make sure the message was clear. Scal, for his part, lowered his head and let out a low howl at Izuku's words, at his pack leader's words. Then Scal stood up and trotted over to the pack. He sniffed each one to remember their scent and then playfully ran around between them. He barked in a distorted tone that made a few shivers at the sound. Sue petted his head gently and Scal wagged his tail without the razor tip moving. "He reminds me of my friend from middle school," she croaked with a smile. Hagakure was next to her as she gingerly touched Scal. He licked her hand and paused for a moment before continuing to enjoy their pets. Scal stopped his playful manner and perked up as they heard rustling from the woods. Everyone turned and prepared themselves for more monsters. Emerging from the tree line was a squad of goblins. Armed with simple spears and bows, they locked eyes with the group of students. "More of these fuckers," Kaken said as his palms crackled. Toshi pulled his knife from its sheath in preparation. "You think they are extra full of bits like the last one?" He grimaced at the upcoming mess. Yaoyorozu lowered her spear. "Keep an eye around. There may be more. Or other creatures." "Scal," Izuku said and pointed at the goblins making noise as they spread out to attack. "Go!" He wanted to see what Scal was capable of. Scal howled into the air and caused the goblins to freeze at the sound before he sprinted from the pack. Faster than any dog they had seen run, Scal closed half the distance in a blink of an eye before his scales shimmer under the sun. Then he disappeared under a mimicry of Hagakure's quirk. The goblins panicked at losing sight of the predator until one goblin was viciously pinned down and its neck torn open. The blood coated Scal's maw and they could see an outline of him as he lunged at the next one with his talons. They cut through them like warm butter. His tail whipped out and struck one goblin in the neck before it turned, and the last one was mauled by Scal as his tail retracted. "Holy hell," Sato said quietly. Izuku watched with his eyebrows raised. Mina poked him and pointed at Scal's form. "It copied Turu. Did you make that thing able to do that?" Kaminari asked. Izuku shook his head. "Nope, just the basic design and need to protect my pack. The rest was not planned." Kaken threw his hands up. "Great, an evolving mutt from hell. We already have one. What's one more?" he said sarcastically. "Don't badmouth Kane. He's the goodest of boys." Zero defended their class dog. Kaken pointed at Izuku. "I meant him." Izuku pouted at the insult. "You're a mutt," he said under his breath. He felt someone poke his side and turned to Mina, who was smiling at him. He smiled back and tilted his head in question. "You said we were your family earlier with Scal. Was that true?" Others nearby who heard Mina's question listened to his response. Izuku beamed at her. "Of course." He turned to the rest of his pack. "I see you all as my family." Mina smiled widely and hugged him. He returned the hug and wrapped his tail around her waist. Kaminari and Kirishima were the first to break into tears at his proclamation and joined in the hug. "Bro!" It wasn't long before the whole group was pulled into the hug with Izuku and Mina in the middle. Toshi was dragged into it by Shoji, who wrapped his arms around half the pack. Kaken was picked up by Sato and Dark Shadow to join the hug by force. He writhed like one of the lampreys on the ground. Izuku felt warmth fill his chest at the closeness of his pack. The sense of them around him and the warm arms embracing him made him feel at peace for a short time until Scal howled and then another howl joined him. Everyone stopped and turned to Scal, who was sniffing another creature that was similar to Scal but different in many ways. The new creature also had the body of a canine, but it was much bulkier with muscles stretching his dark skin. The jaw was larger and split down the lower jaw to show many sharp teeth. The head of the new creature looked like someone attached a battering ram to it with vicious spikes on a bone plate that took up most of its head. The neck was thick enough to take the impact of using such a weapon. On its back were two thick tendrils that looked strong enough to tear a tree up by its roots. Its legs were shorter but built strong for bursts of speed. "Izuku," Toshi said quietly. "Yeah, Toshi," Izuku replied just as quietly. "Why is there another thing that looks out of my nightmares next to Skal?" he asked. Izuku didn't answer right away as he was observing the second creature. "I think Skal made him." He glanced at the area around the reptile canine to see no lamprey and the goblins were gone. "Should we worry?" Yaoyorozu asked worriedly at the scene before her. It was literally out of some horror stories she read when she wanted something different. Skal turned from the creature and trotted up to the group, and the other one followed. It eyed all of the pack in curiosity. Skal sat beside Izuku as the creature stomped closer. It stopped and bowed its thick head to Izuku in submission to him. The feral boy watched him for a moment longer before he reached out to the creature Skal made. He felt the connection between cells just like felt with Skal. The creature raised his head and its forked tongue licked Izuku's hand. He patted its thick head. "Doll, that is your name now. Protect our pack," Izuku said, smiling. Doll's tendrils wagged like tails in happiness and went to his pack to get acquainted with them. Just like with Skal, it took a bit for them to get used to such a unique creature, but soon enough Sato was rubbing Doll's belly furiously as Doll kicked his leg in the air. "I mean, at this point, it doesn't matter. We are in a simulation and we will need help with the monsters. If Skal is anything to go by, Doll will be a huge help," Zero said. "Like I need help," Kakin yelled out. "Bro, that ogre was tough. Imagine if Doll was helping us out by taking out its legs. That big boy has to pack a punch. Just look at him." Kirishima motioned to the rippling muscles on Doll. Yaoyorozu tapped on Izuku's shoulder to ask him, "Izuku, are you not worried about this getting out of hand?" Skal essentially reproduced asexually, and if Doll can do the same. She left the rest unsaid as she eyed the two creatures, not with distrust but with curiosity. Izuku tilted his head from side to side. He knew exactly what Yaoyorozu was worried about, but he had a master plan to make sure they didn't get out of control. "That's simple. They will listen to me, and if they don't, then I will make them. When I first helped Kane, it wasn't to make him part of my pack. I just wanted to help him, but now he is a great companion and guard." He motioned to the two abominations. "We'll help the pack stay safe," he said with all the resolve in his small compact body. "And if they multiply, it's only a simulation." He shrugged with a smile. "I see your point. They do seem very capable if Skal is anything to go by." Yaoyorozu agreed. Izuku beamed at her. "This is a vacation where we can do almost whatever. Rozu, let's have some fun at least." She smiled in return and felt happy at the nickname. "Well, I know it's been a few hours, but I'm spent. I say we go to the beach to relax a bit. How is it?" Kaminari turned to the group who were scouting the ocean side. "Maybe we find a grill for a barbecue and some bathing suits. What do you say?" "The ocean has leviathans," Shoji said bluntly. Everyone turned at that and Kaminari's face paled. "Like giant sea monsters? How big?" Jairu answered that one. "Massive. We only saw a fin, but it was the size of the dorms. We didn't look any closer after that." She twirled her ear jacks. Everyone was quiet at that until Kirishima broke it. "Well, so long as we stay in the shallows, it'll be fine. Right, guys?" He looked with optimism. They agreed to a barbecue and limited themselves to dipping their feet in the water up to their shins. It didn't take long to raid the homes of the town to find a few grills. Food to grill took a bit longer, but by the end of their raiding session, they had arms full of meat and vegetables to eat. Izuku helped a bit with the food but was shooed off by others who had skill at the grill. Izuku shrugged and sat on the sand, his tail absent-mindedly playing with the sand. Mina sat beside him and he put his wing around her. She smiled at him and they chatted about nothing in particular. They made plans to explore and time for Izuku to go off hunting in the deep wilderness without having to worry about them holding him back. As everyone relaxed for a bit, Izuku took note that Skal found the remains of the griffin. The beast wasted no time in diving in to eat, and Dal joined him soon after. When they ate their fill, the two stared at the remains. Skal had his tail stabbed into the flesh, and Dal's tendrils penetrated the opening they ate. It wasn't long before the remains dissolved into a mass and then split. They pulled their appendages out, and soon the masses took shape into canine shapes. One was small with protrusions on its shoulders that shifted around. They looked like crossbows similar to the one he used from time to time. It had large eyes and ears with claws on its paws for gripping onto walls. The other one looks menacing with spines all over its back and head like a porcupine, but they looked more like long hairs combed back. Tendrils extended from his sides with needle-like carapace tips. Dal and Skal howled in celebration of their newest brothers being created. The two new creatures followed suit soon after and howled with their elder brothers. Chapter 58. Spiders, bombs, and more. With a stretch and a yawn that showed off all his perfect white teeth, Izuku got up from the futon. He did go to sleep with his wings out, but they got in the way of lying down. He also poked Mina a few too many times, so he retracted them. She got up at the same time, grumbling about it being too early, but she followed her maid out of bed. She wore a too large shirt they had found in the dresser of the house they claimed. The shorts were baggy on her too, but she seemed comfortable in them. The house they slept in was in the village area of the simulation. It was nice with 3 bedrooms. Toshi and Shoji shared one with Jairu and Yaoyorozu taking the other one, while Izuku and Mina claimed the biggest room. The rest of the pack took houses nearby for safety, and also because the 4 creatures Izuku created roamed the area at night when they slept. First Skal duplicated or reproduced asexually Izuku wasn't sure to make Dal. Then the two scavenged the remains of the griffin, and 2 more joined the pack of apex predators. Keel, the one with many spines on his body, was a frontline fighter. He had durable scales under the spines and 4 tendrils for lashing on his back when Izuku examined him the night before. Oriole was slim and designed for longer-range combat. He had crossbows Izuku sometimes used, but they were much larger and attached to his body. The bone bolts were longer and looked like they could punch through trees. His claws were also interesting since they resembled more of a prey bird than a canine with backward-facing talons for gripping onto many surfaces. Izuku didn't look too deep into the anatomy of Oriole before he went to sleep, but he was interested in how his body produced the bolts. The 6 teens scavenged around the unfamiliar kitchen for breakfast to start their day. Toshi was grumbling all the while. When asked about his mood, he told them he didn't have his phone. The phone he often used to entertain himself when he lay sleepless due to his insomnia. They teased him about being too attached to his phone as they ate what they found. They turned from their food when they heard a ruckus outside, but when the sound stopped and everyone heard for howls, they looked at each other. They wandered outside to see what had happened. Behind one of the houses closer to the forest was a large corpse of a spider. It was the size of a truck. Jairu turned back inside with a quiet nope and went back to her breakfast. The pack of dogs Izuku knew weren't dogs, but they looked like dogs, so they were dogs, sniffed at the spider. Multiple legs of the spider were broken, bone bolts were stuck in its body, and many lacerations covered the monster. Oriole leapt on the spider's back and absorbed the bone bolts into his body. Dal nibbled on one of the cracked legs but shook his head and backed away, likely at the bad taste. Skal was on the rooftops scanning the area and sniffing the air for more threats. And Keel sat proudly in front of his kill, his tendrils waving like tails on a dog. "That's a big fuck-off spider," Toshi said under his breath. "Ruzo, you think you can make some fire bombs or something?" He batted the tendril from Izuku that was poking him for saying a curse word. Yaoyorozu stared at the spider and shivered. Those kinds of spiders shouldn't wander from their web. Izuku and Shoji got closer to the enormous arachnid so get a closer look. The 4 hunters saw Izuku's approach and gathered for attention. He obliged and praised each one for the good work protecting the pack. He rubbed Skal's head, patted Dal's thick hide, scratched Keel's cheeks, and stroked Oriole's head in congratulations. They were happy and trotted beside Izuku to look over the spider. Yaoyorozu was right. This type of spider usually waded in their webs with their large bulbous abdomen and thin legs. Like a black widow but without the red hourglass and longer body. "You think there are more?" Shoji asked the hunter. "Most likely," Izuku nodded. He examined the fangs of the spider, which were the size of his hands. If their nest is nearby, then we will have to hunt them down. All that is holy, is that a giant spider? They turned to the sound of Kaminari shouting down the road. Others of Izuku's pack were emerging from the houses lining the street. Kaken was scowling and getting closer to Izuku and Shoji next to the spider. He glared at the large beast. "Creepy fuckers," he said with a snarl. Pack of 1A ate their breakfast and began to scout the area for the nest of spiders. Everyone was on board to exterminate the giant arachnid nest. Most of them were comfortable with spiders. They are relatively harmless and they cut down on pests, so they were usually captured and released outside. That changed when they were the sizes of buildings and the pack was the size of the pests. Hooking up some cables to a small TV, Yaoyorozu got a camera feed from the drone she created to scout. Could have sent out some birds to come back if they found anything. It wasn't long before a bird came back to Kuta with information about the nest location. Yaoyorozu sent the drone in the direction the bird directed, into the city. Everyone was gathered around the TV and most gasped when they saw at least 3 tall buildings coated in spiderwebs. The 4th building on the block was being invaded by spiders of all sizes to expand their territory. There was no clear leader, but they saw many spiders the size of the one the pack of dogs took down. "Yamamo, can't you just create some bombs to drop on all of that?" Jairu asked hopefully. Everyone turned to her and she was about to lecture about the collateral damage but paused. "I could, but we would need to deliver it in person. Also, we would need to leave quickly." Everyone then turned to Izuku. Izuku shrugged. "I'll be your carpet bomber." He smiled with all his teeth showing. "But I want one of those bomber hats from that one movie. With goggles." He pointed at Yaoyorozu, adorned with his brown synthetic leather cap and goggles. Izuku looked at the now 4 buildings covered in spiderwebs. His pack stood a few blocks away on top of a building that overlooked the targeted area. They could all see the swarms of spiders crawling along the webs and the many creatures caught in them. Some were being wrapped up for consumption and others were left stuck in the thick webs. He turned from the view to Yaoyorozu, who was nervously checking over the barrel they had filled with extremely volatile explosives. It took a while for Yaoyorozu to create the substance and had to eat 3 large meals to fill the barrel. Some of the pack were drawing on the sides of the barrel. They had found paint in one of the houses and Mina proposed to decorate the bomb that should level 4 skyscrapers and everything inside. They had taped stabilizer fins on the side and put a cone on top to make it more aerodynamic on the drop. The fins were cut from thin wood and the cone was a piece of tin bent into shape and then taped together. The sides were painted with everything you could imagine, from crude messages to the spiders to a cute drawing of a stereotypical bomb that Kuta drew. "All right, I believe it's ready. The glass bottle is set for the chain reaction, so all you need to do is drop it from a safe distance. It shouldn't fail. Even so, I set a small time device inside to go off in case it gets caught in the webs miraculously." Yaoyorozu stood up and looked at Izuku. He turned from the buildings almost a mile away and nodded confidently. "I got this. You got this." Mina copied and pulled his goggles off his forehead down to his eyes. She kissed his cheek and smiled. "Now, rain hellfire." Izuku beamed at her and moved to pick up the barrel. Uraraka tapped the barrel and smiled at him. The plan was for Izuku to carry the barrel and then dive bomb the location. When Uraraka saw him diving for more than a second, she would drop her quirk and he would let the bomb go. He began his ascension to the skies. His pack saluted him and he was off. Bit by bit, Izuku disappeared into the clouds in the sky for a proper distance to drop his payload. Uraraka brought up binoculars to her eyes, ready to drop the use of her quirk. "So, how confident are you that it'll get rid of the spiders?" Mina asked Yaoyorozu as they looked at the infested buildings. When Yaoyorozu didn't answer immediately, she began to get nervous. "You are confident, right?"
Yaoyorozu bit her lip.
"Well, I've never made this substance, so..." Mina looked at her friend and then turned to the clouds. "It'll be fine, right?" She chuckled anxiously. "Of course, I'll be fine. This Yaoyorozu we're talking about. She knows her stuff even if she's never created whatever that stuff was." Uraraka said confidently, not taking her eyes off the location where Izuku was supposed to emerge from the clouds. The class stood watching and waiting for Izuku to appear again. It didn't take long before he emerged from the clouds in a dive. his wings tucked in slightly for the best drop. Even from so far away, they could see his wide feral smile. Izuku was laughing in ecstasy as he dropped like a rock from the stratosphere. His mouth began to dry out, so his bone plates grew to cover his mouth from catching the wind. When he felt Uraraka release her quirk on the bomb, Izuku pulled his wings up and let go of the barrel. He continued to dive down, but his wings carried him away from the drop site at an angle at high speed. All according to the plan. Good. Good. All looks good. Yaoyorozu looked eager to see how effective her creation was. The barrel disappeared between the 4 skyscrapers and everyone held their breaths. For a split second, there was a flash of light. Then the buildings evaporated, they came apart, and debris shot out with the shockwave. Yaoyorozu widened her eyes in horror. The yield was much larger. Down! She grabbed whoever was nearest to her and yanked them down with her. Before she dropped down, she witnessed Izuku in the sky before the blast wave obscured her vision. He was much closer than they were. They heard the sound of countless windows shattering as the blast wave overtook them. The building they stood on shook violently, and everyone had the same thought. Would the tall skyscraper drop with them still on it? The blast wave passed, and the class remained disoriented on the roof. Their hearing was ringing and they were shaken. Slowly, they stood up on unsteady legs and looked at the devastation of the bomb. The spiders were obliterated. The targeted buildings were gone. The city block has a large crater, and the surrounding buildings were damaged beyond repair. There should have been a dense cloud of dust, but the bomb was created too well and the blast took care of that too. Izuku! That was the first thing Yaoyorozu heard. She was pale and sweaty at seeing the devastation. She turned to Mina, who she had pulled down with her. Mina looked horrified and scanned the area where Izuku was last, but he was nowhere to be found. He's strong, he'll be fine, she said to herself as she kept looking. Ponytail, what the hell was that? Kaken yelled. The yield was larger than predicted. This was the first time I've used it. Yaoyorozu responded. I recently learned of it and thought it was a good idea, but it's clear that the yield was vastly understated, or it has an exponential blast depending on the amount detonated. She rambled on nervously. I'm so sorry, Mina. I didn't know. She began to tear up. Yaoyorozu felt a pair of strong arms around her. He'll be all right, he's strong. He'll be back. She both said it to reassure Yaoyorozu and herself. Izuku was not all right. He was lying against a tree and injured severely. The blast of the bomb sent him flying into the woods and he landed harshly. He was in extreme pain from the multiple injuries, but he dulled the pain to a throb. From bottom to top, his left leg from the knee down was just gone, sheared off by debris flying faster than he could dodge. Right leg damaged by smaller debris but easily managed. The abdomen had many ruptured organs and lacerations due to supersonic debris. His lungs were punctured and deflating, but he could deal with that in a moment. His wings were shredded from the shockwave, but that was unimportant. His tail was damaged, but it was just hardened bone, so it was an easy fix. His unlucky arm? Gone. No clue how that happened, but he had a stump for an arm. His other arm was miraculously undamaged. His head was marginally alright compared to how the rest of his body was. He was still focusing on making sure nothing was wrong with his brain before he moved onto his body and the hundreds of fractures across it. It was getting late when Izuku's first prey approached his mangled body. The blood must have attracted the literal dinosaur approaching him. Izuku stared at the creature from the ancient past as it smelled him. He still hadn't moved from his spot in favor of fixing himself before he moved. He was unconscious for hours before he regained it, and it was already past noon when he had awakened. So he had missed his lunch and he was ravenously hungry. The dinosaur was at least 6 feet tall and 7 long from the sharp tooth muzzle to the tip of its long tail. Izuku could tell immediately it was a hunter, but it was lacking. Its arms were short and unsuited for grabbing, eyes too far apart, and it was loud. He had to admit the legs looked strong and made from chasing down prey. Its claws looked nice and sharp, with the largest claw hovering over the rest, ready to pierce its prey. And the teeth looked vicious. It was a shame that Izuku was starving and his prey came to him. The velociraptor approached confidently to the immobile Izuku and lowered its head to sniff its meal. The hunter stuck faster than it could react. His hand grabbed a hold of its neck, claws digging deep into it as his spear-tipped tail pierced where he thought its heart was. He guessed correctly as the dinosaur stiffened and died. Tendrils extended from his body as it was rapidly consumed. All that was left was a talon from its leg as a trophy. He attached it to his waist next to the talon of the griffin that was still there. It was one of the first things he checked. All the iron in the body of the dinosaur was sent to his leg to recreate it. He could go without an arm but not a missing leg. It didn't take long before his leg was back to how it was, but with the missing reinforcement of steel covering it. He could still walk on it, but using it to move rapidly would fracture it due to the muscles being too strong for it. He slowly began to move and then stood up. Most of his weight was on the thick tree he sat against. He finally got a chance to take in his surroundings. He was in the woods. Not the first time waking up in the woods. He was in the thick forest and all he saw were trees, brush, and more trees. For now, he decided on a direction and began to walk. He needed more mass to fix himself and he was still hungry. Just in time, there was a screech of something in the woods. Some sort of deer ran past him and then another. Dozens of deer creatures fled from what made the sound earlier. Izuku grabbed one of the fleeing deer and quickly killed it. It was torn apart and consumed within minutes. He turned when he heard footsteps getting closer. A large form rounded a tree, its clawed hands pushing against the tree to get past it. It stood 10 feet tall and had a humanoid appearance with 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head in the correct locations. On top of that, it had a thick lizard-like tail, bloody razor-sharp teeth, and was covered in a thick leathery hide. Its maw was similar to a crocodile but shorter. The odd thing out was it had horns like his. It was hunched over slightly, but Izuku could tell immediately that this was a predator. The predator turned its small eyes onto Izuku and growled. Izuku stood from the bloody mess and shifted. His missing arm was replaced by dozens of tendrils intertwined to shape his limb. Claws extended from his tendril hand while a spear was held in the other. His goggles were placed on his forehead and his second pair of eyes opened to stare the predator down. The hunter growled back and the predator watched him. It raked its claws on the tree as if it was sharpening them for combat. The hunter crouched to pounce, ready for blood. The predator roared in a challenge and charged forward. The hunter roared back and leaping into the charge of the predator. Chapter 59. Stroll in the woods. The hunter dodged to the side as the reptilian creature tried to slam both of its claws down on him. He returned the attack by raking his claw on the leg of the creature. His claws skittered off the thick scales and did no damage. This didn't stop him as he leaped onto the creature's back to get at its neck. The creature responded by throwing itself back with all its strength against a tree. They both slammed into it and then threw it. The hunter took the brunt of it. The creature righted itself and backed away quickly to lower itself into a crouched position to pounce the hunter. The hunter, for his part, rolled onto his legs and readied himself for the next round. Izuku stared at the creature and could see its intelligence as it watched him instead of attacking without restraint. This wasn't a wild animal but a worthy predator. The predator leapt from one side to another at an angle to the hunter, gaining speed with each movement. The hunter held in place and took the attack head-on. Long claws raked the air to tear the hunter in half and he formed a shield made of carapace. The claws dug deep into the shield and the hunter used his tail to strike at the predator's abdomen. The predator roared in pain and used its tail to hit the hunter. Leaping over the thick appendage, he landed and propelled himself to a nearby tree trunk. His non-reinforced leg bones cracked, but he paid it no mind. He used the tree trunk as a springboard to push himself towards the predator. With his spear leading the charge, he penetrated deep into the thick scales on the side of the predator. Once again, it roared and slammed his clawed fist down on the hunter's back. He was slammed down and the predator pounced just as the hunter rolled over. One clawed hand stabbed into the hunter's shoulder and the other missed by inches. The hunter roared in pain and used his tail to spear the forearm of the predator. Blood sprayed over the hunter as the arm was mangled when the predator pulled the hand back, causing the spear-tipped tail to split the hand down the middle. The predator roared and used its whole hand to rake against the hunter's face. Claws met claws as the hunter blocked the attack and used his free hand to grab the predator's injured arm. He pulled and the predator went with the movement to avoid more pain, causing the predator to fall and the hunter to roll on top of it. pinning one clawed hand with his clawed hand and the other two injured to be of any use, he used his free hand to grab one of the horns to pull the head up. It caused the neck to be exposed, and the hunter opened his jaws wide and bit down. He yanked to the side, and a large chunk of flesh was torn away as blood sprayed all over the hunter. The thrashing of the predator slowed and then stopped under the hunter. He held the predator's head still as it bled out and mentally gave it respect for a worthy fight. When it finally died, the hunter roared in triumph and the thick forest shook at the sound. Izuku hopped from tree to tree as he tried to get higher to see where he should go to find his pack. With a new trophy on his waist, the skull of the predator without its jaw, he reached the top of the tallest tree and looked around. He was surprised to see the city, the only other thing visible other than woods, far in the distance, at least 10 to 20 miles away. He sprouted his wings, flapped them once, and then paused. He looked down at the thick woods and then at the skull. His pack was strong and they had 4 apex predators to help them stay alive. He looked down at the woods between himself and the city. He smiled and his wings retracted into his back. The pack didn't need him too soon. With that settled, he dropped from the treetop and eagerly scanned the woods he found himself in. With his impeccable sense of direction to lead the way, he began to make his way through the woods. Back at the village, Mina bit at her fingernail in worry. Her hand was pulled away from her teeth by Jiru. "You need to calm down and find something to do. Sitting here tearing your fingernails apart won't make him come back faster. Plus, I can hear it and it's gross," Jiru said, scrunching her nose in disgust. Mina sighed and slumped onto the table. They were seated outside on a patio eating their lunch when her mate came back into her mind. She was worried if he was still alive or not. If she knew that at least, then she would know whether he was all right or not. If he died, then he was out of the simulation. If he was alive, then nothing could stop him from coming back. The issue was that she didn't know. What if he was unconscious somewhere or was lost deep in the woods? What should I do then? Mina asked with her head still on the table. I don't know. Go with the guys and help them with the hole. Jiru motioned to the beach nearby. Mina turned her head to see most of the guys in her pack digging away in the sand with their hands and shovels. It started with Kaminari digging a small hole so he could sit in it for whatever reason. First, Shiro and Kirishima joined, and then one by one just about all the guys joined in. The only ones who didn't join in digging a hole to the center of the simulation were Kuta and Aoyama, who sat on beach towels nearby. Kaken got roped in by some teasing and Ida was easily convinced when asked about the proper use of a shovel. Todoroki was one of the first ones to push sand out of the hole with his ice. It looked like he thoroughly enjoyed it. Mina sighed and straightened from her seated position. I'm sure Izuku is alive and fine. She snorted a laugh. Hell, he's probably having the time of his life without having to worry about keeping us safe. She looked over to the thick woods. The hunter laughed with glee as he dodged a spear thrust from a pig-nosed humanoid with green skin. Another one of its kind swung its sword down at the hunter's back, and he dodged it while yanking the spear from the other and used it to stab deep into his chest. The spear user roared in fury at seeing his weapon being used to claim the life of one of its kind. The fury was short-lived as he was lifted off the ground by clawed hands driving deep into his abdomen from under him. The pig-nosed humanoid spat blood into the hunter's face as he pulled a knife and stabbed down at his neck. He was a true warrior and he died as he lived. Jiru huffed a laugh and nodded with her friend. Oh, I can totally see that. I'll bet you that he'll come back with trophies adoring his whole body. God, that is so metal to imagine. The two girls turned when Hagakure called out to them. Yo, since we can't go to the beach because Thulu and its sibling are in the ocean, we brought the ocean to us. Do not call his name lest we call attention to ourselves. Tokoyami admonished the invisible girl and looked worriedly at the sea. Hagakure waved off the bird-headed student. Yeah. Anyways, come on. She pulled at Jiru's and Mina's arms. They joined the rambunctious girl to see the boys finish digging a deep and wide hole and move on to digging a trench from the hole to the water to fill it. They dug the trench with such coordination that Mina could believe they worked in construction all their lives. With single-minded focus, they reached the waters and cheered when the water flowed to begin filling the hole. Immediately, everyone began to get into the pool. Some others began to create another hole for those who wanted to soak in the water without being splashed. I don't know about you guys, but this vacation is pretty nice. Not including all the fantasy and horrific monsters here with us, Kaminari said as he floated on his back. Sato with Todoroki was digging yet another hole in the sand, answered his friend. Yeah, those monsters are a downer on the vacation, especially those spiders. He shivered at the memory. Good thing Yamamo evaporated them. Hagakure laughed while sitting on an inflatable tube. She quieted and added softly, "Hopefully, Izuku is all right." She glanced over to the pack of 4 hellhounds roughhousing with enough strength to snap bones on a normal person. The feral animal is fine. I've seen him take injuries that would kill anyone else. On top of that, he is in a buffet to heal himself. Kaken reminisced back at the training camp and how half of Izuku's face was burned down to the bones when he took a blow that would have killed him outright. Hell, I seriously doubt there is anything he couldn't take down. Toshi used a pool noodle to lazily doggy paddle around the pool. Ah, is Kaken praising little Aizu? How sweet, he teased. Kaken countered the teasing by pushing Toshi's head underwater. Shut it, troll hair. Toshi came up from under the water looking like a drowned dog. His hair was matted to his head and the usual fluff on his head was around his neck. He glared at Kaken. Go bury yourself up to your neck in the sand. His quirk took hold and the blonde got out of the pool mechanically. He began digging a hole for himself. Kirishima grinned and began to help the brainwashed packmate. Shiro and Kaminari jumped out of the pool and did the same with wicked smiles. Mina looked over at them and shook her head. She knew what would happen once Kaken got out. Ida felt the urge to stop them, but he reminded himself that they were on vacation in the simulation. Not that it felt too much like it with all the beasts. Thinking about beasts, Ida wondered how Izuku was doing. He hoped he would get back to them soon. The beast in question was currently on a small opening surrounded by bodies of pig-nosed warriors, their weapons strewn around and their armor shattered. He had just finished a battle with their leader. He was twice as strong with feathers adorning his helmet. The leader used a large double-sided axe that he used very masterfully to cut off one of Izuku's arms at the elbow and sheared a horn of his head. It was a glorious fight in Izuku's opinion, and from a great fight came a great trophy. He picked up the double-sided axe. It was heavy, but nothing Izuku couldn't handle. He set it on his back and a tendril held it for him. He turned in the direction of the city. He was headed and numerous trophies rattled around his waist. Skulls, claws, fangs, and even monkey's clawed paw. The monkey was one of the toughest fights due to its speed and seemingly ability to disappear from his sight when losing line of sight. The whole monkey was only the size of his head, but it was vicious in its guerrilla tactics. Just as he was going to leave, he looked at the bodies. It would be a waste to leave them, but he wasn't hungry and his stores were full. He did think of making something like Skal again, but he didn't need more skirmishers like them. Maybe a heavy hitter? With a shrug, he jammed his hand into the leader's chest and began to experiment. He wanted his new companion to be strong. He began with the skeleton and made it dense, but with enough flexibility for the bones not to shatter if they encounter a greater force. The nervous system wouldn't need to be too high since he wasn't making it for speed. Muscles would be extremely dense, more so than his. He wanted to see them tear a tree out by the roots. Tendons and ligaments would need to be just as strong to keep up. Strong but spongy organs to make them take an impact without serious damage. Now the exterior. He shaped them like a gorilla. They could use their large arms to run with, and their shorter legs would maintain stability. And what's better than 2 incredibly strong arms? For incredibly strong arms, he set the second set right under the first pair. Dexterous hands to grab things, but thick and vicious-looking knuckles to tear anything that got in his path. His second pair of hands were the opposite, with razor-sharp claws that looked very similar to his. Thumbs were a given. Everyone needed thumbs. The skin will be covered in thick fur and scales for added protection. Their head would be simple with 4 eyes like Izuku's, teeth for both vegetation and meat, and its nose didn't need to be anything special. With his image clear, Izuku's tendrils grabbed more and more bodies to fuel the creation of his creation. Some were used for material to add to the leader, and some were consumed to keep the creature alive as it was born. While Izuku knew the word born wasn't entirely correct, He liked to believe it fit. Something is born when its first creation, whether that be from a newborn from a mother, a chick from an egg, or a biological assimilation to become something new. Just as Izuku was going to feed another body to his creation, a tendril shot out from the forming body and grabbed the body from his hand. It wrapped around Izuku's wrist and froze. Then it let go of him and only took the body. Izuku stared in fascination at the reaction it just had. Both the growing of tendrils to feed and its knowledge that Izuku wasn't food. The only commands he gave to the cells were to keep themselves alive, protect the pack, and not to duplicate. He didn't need hundreds of super gorillas by the end of his vacation. There wouldn't be anything to hunt then. Izuku stared at his creation's fur finish growing and then stopped. A pair of powerful lungs inflated for the first time and his 4 eyes opened. He began to shuffle on the ground, stretching muscles, and feeling his surroundings. He touched the earth with his hands and sniffed the air. He looked around and then shuffled to sit up, using all 4 of his arms to stand up, and looked around and looked at himself as best as he could. Then he looked up at Izuku. He hooted in a sort of greeting, and then he did it again in joy. Izuku smiled, showing all his teeth. The creature hopped and the forest shook at its landing. He got louder and louder until it culminated into a roar that shook the forest. He pounded his chest in exultation, and Izuku joined his newest creature with his own roar. Back on the beach, the 19 packmates and 4 hounds turned their heads to the forests, where they all saw flocks of birds take off and a distant roar echoed. The 4 hounds turned to the skies and howled with the distant roar. The packmates already knew what must have happened, and they waited to see what Izuku walked back with. Finished with the roar, Izuku turned to his newest companion. "You are strong, I say, Nork." Nork hooted and joy at his name. He pounded his chest with one hand. Izuku grinned and nodded. "Good. Let's find our pack." There was a screech of a dinosaur like the one Izuku first killed, and Nork turned to show his prowess. Izuku stepped back to see what he could do. The dinosaur heard their racket and came to find a meal, but instead, it found Nork's fist uppercutting it in the chest. The dinosaur had no chance of surviving that blow, as it practically exploded from the sheer power put behind the strike. The leaves above them were coated in red. Izuku nodded with pursed lips. He gave Nork a thumbs up when he turned to his creator for his thoughts. "Nice job, but next time use less power, less messy." He motioned to the red dripping on them from the canopy. Nork hooted and nodded. He turned to the mess left behind and sniffed distastefully before following Izuku to where the end of the woods should be. The two walked through the woods, and Izuku chatted to Nork about their pack. He told him about them and what they were like. Nork listened to Izuku all the while they tore through anything that got in their way. It wasn't long before the tree line opened up to the beach, where his pack lay around in pools of water or cooked on grills. The pack turned when the hounds barked and ran to greet Izuku and their newest brother. Izuku beamed at all of them and went to join and introduce Nork to his pack. Nork, for his part, hooted in greeting to his elder brothers and followed their creator to their packmates. The hounds ran around Nork in excitement at having such a large brother. Doll was already trying to bull him over to play. Izuku felt happy with his pack getting along so well. Chapter 60. Reunion. "Get some clothes on," was the first thing Izuku heard from his pack. He wasn't sure who yelled it, but he did glance down at himself. His lower bits were covered with a leather pelt from the predator he fought first when he woke up. His clothes were torn asunder from the blast, but that didn't bother him. It wasn't the first time he was nude in the woods. He was greeted by his mate, who ran up to him with a big hug and smile. He caught her and returned the hug as the rest of his pack gathered around him and Nork. They greeted him with the same gusto as always. Yaoyorozu tried to apologize to him for the danger she put him in, but Izuku waved it off. He was just happy to see them safe. They asked him about the deep woods and what he had found in it. Izuku happily told them about his fights and the numerous trophies he had gathered in his trek. He presented each one in the order of collecting them and told them the creature he took them off of. As the feral class president regaled the pack of his exploits, Jairu leaned over to Mina and said quietly enough that Izuku wouldn't hear. "He doesn't remember that this is a simulation and nothing we get here comes out." Mina's smile strained as she nodded. "I'm well aware. Let him have his fun," she whispered back. She happily took the upper skull of a large reptilian creature, and Izuku beamed with joy at seeing her pride in him.
Yo.
Zu, what about this big guy? You say his name is Nork? Sato asked the large four-armed gorilla who was gently roughhousing Kirishima. Nork was seated as Kirishima was trying to pin one arm alone but was failing. For his part, Nork was hooting in a laugh as he easily manhandled the redhead. When Dahl joined in, Nork was bowled over and the real fight began. The three rolled in the sand and everyone who wasn't as fragile watched it happen. Izuku shrugged. When I finished fighting the tribe of those pig people, he pulled the dual-headed axe off his back and sunk the blade into the sand. There were a lot of them and didn't want to waste all the biomass. We have a pack of hunters. He motioned to the 4 dogs. Now, we have a heavy hitter. If you're calling Nork a heavy hitter, then he must be stronger than all of us put together, Kaken said with his arms crossed. That's a good point. How strong is he? Kaminari asked. Izuku pursed his lips and tilted his head in thought. He punched a dinosaur and it exploded. Everyone turned to Izuku to gauge his face to see how much he was exaggerating. Oh, my God, you're not joking, Tsuyu said almost immediately as she saw his facial expressions. He exploded a dinosaur? Toshi asked incredulously. Small ankle bitters or... Sato raised his hand to guess the height of the creature. Kuda raised the claw he was looking at from Izuku's collection of trophies. This is from a velociraptor. He turned sheepish when everyone turned to him, the question unasked. I went through a phase when I was younger. Hold on a patty flipping minute, Zero exclaimed. Since when were there dinosaurs? Are there those giant pterodactyls? He frantically looked into the sky. You mean pterosaurs? Kuda asked. If it's the flying one that can swallow us whole, then yes. He scrambled under Shoji's arms and used them as shelter. Hagakure pointed out another threat. What about that dragon we saw? Can't that do the same? And breathe fire. As they panicked about flying titans in the sky, Izuku plopped down next to Mina on the sands. He bumped his head with hers and she reciprocated with a giggle. The two enjoyed watching Zero show his fear of giant flying beings by hiding under various things. Scal joined his creator and lay down by Izuku. He patted the creature as he enjoyed being back with his pack. Later, Izuku twirled the dual-headed axe he took from the orc chief. He was told what they were by Sato. The axe was nice, but it wasn't his style, so he jammed it into the wood of a nearby wall and let it be. He hummed in thought at his selection of weapons. He usually stuck with claws and fangs, but also used his tail, spears, and even bolts. Maybe he could create a spear like Yamamo carried around. He was pretty adept at using one, even though he was never formally trained in using it. He did have a surplus of biomass, and playing with his quirk was always fun, so he got started. He didn't honestly think he would keep the spear or make it a permanent fixture to himself, but it was fun to experiment. He began simply by making a core of bone with a latticework inside the bone. He tested out various kinds of latticeworks to see which one held the best for his uses and found a honeycomb pattern to be adequate. With the interior finished, he moved on to the exterior. So he didn't use so much steel from his body, he just made the spear tip covered in metal. The blade was wide and thin as he could make it without it bending. What he could do that regular blacksmiths couldn't was also add a lattice inside the metal to make it even sturdier. He grinned as he twirled the spear. It was just as tall as he was and probably the strongest thing he made so far. Yaoyorozu was watching him make the weapon in interest and came over to see his work. He happily presented it as she asked to see it. She asked about the lightweight but hardness of the spear, and Izuku explained his idea of saving mass with latticework. That intrigued her greatly, and she kept questioning him about the idea. Soon enough, she was seated in the sand, also experimenting with making items with latticework, both to save on material and its weight while keeping its strengths. While Izuku helped Yaoyorozu with her quirk, something was happening a few dozen feet away with two pack members. Kaminari and Kirishima had the wonderful idea to play with the dual-headed axe their pack leader brought back with him. It started with Kaminari using all his strength to yank the weapon from the wood post, causing it to come out and hit Kirishima. Luckily, Kirishima had a good reaction time and hardened his body to block the accidental strike. From there, Kaminari began to swing at Kirishima with his skin hardened with a giant grin on his face with the redhead mirroring him. It was only when Kaminari began to scream when everyone in the area spun to see him clutching at a profusely bleeding hand. Their first serious injury occurred. Izuku immediately sprinted off the sand by Yaoyorozu and she was right behind him. Kirishima was looking pale and unsure how to help as he hovered over his friend. "Todoroki, I need ice," Kirishima yelled out. Izuku soon found out why Kirishima needed ice. 2 fingers lay on the sand and Kaminari had 2 stumps where they belonged. As the blonde kept sobbing in pain, Izuku got to work. After all, he'd work with worse. Izuku picked up the 2 digits and grabbed Kaminari by the arm. "Don't stop screaming, worry. I can fix it. My fucking fingers," Kaminari screamed. "Don't use bad words." Izuku screamed back and grabbed the wrist with the bleeding stumps. Yaoyorozu made a bowl and with the help of Todoroki, used water to rinse off the sandy fingers. "This might hurt a bit. It already fuck." Kaminari yelped even louder. Then he looked at his hand in worry. "It stopped hurting. That's bad, right?" What Kaminari didn't see was Izuku's tendril in his wrist. With his knowledge of biology so advanced, he knew exactly where to find the right nerve to stop feeling in his hand to begin to heal him. "It's fine. Just look at the clouds or something." He waved off the concerns as he focused on reattaching the fingers. He grabbed one from a sickly-looking Yaoyorozu and stared at it. Which one was this one? He mumbled and imagined placing it on one of the stumps. He shook his head and placed it on the other stump. It looked correct, so he began. With most of his pack watching on, Izuku began splicing nerves back together, mending bones and sewing flesh to how it should be. Hair-thin tendrils wove in and out of the finger as he made sure veins were correct and nerves were aligned. He hummed in satisfaction at the first finger beginning to pump blood again, and the nerves began to fire signals properly. He could tell each nerve working properly as he sent signals through the tendril in Kaminari's wrist. The second finger was just as simple, and soon enough, Izuku smiled proudly as he looked at his handiwork. "There. All done," Izuku said proudly. He retracted his tendril, blocking the nerve in Kaminari's wrist, and he yelped in pain before sighing in relief at the lack of intense pain. The blonde cried in relief as he opened and closed his hand with no issue. Kirishima also looked just as relieved. Even though he was soaked in blood from his fingers, he was as healthy as he could be, just with some blood loss. Kaminari exhibited blood loss as he tried to stand up only to stumble and fall on the bloodied sand. Izuku didn't look worried as he lay in front of him groaning in a dizzy spell. "Bro!" Kirishima sat his friend up and looked worriedly. "It's just blood loss, but that doesn't matter. What does matter is how did he lose 2 fingers?" Izuku asked with crossed arms. He looked at the axe and picked it up. Kirishima looked bashfully away from his pack leader's eyes. "We were sparring with the axe. He hit me with it and ricocheted back to himself, and his hand went to high on the handle." Izuku wasn't surprised at the answer. Even so, Ida and Yaoyorozu admonished the 2 for doing something so dangerous without reason. While they berated the 2, Izuku looked at the axe blades. Chipped and worn metal with just a bit of Kaminari's blood staining it. He sniffed the metal and frowned. He looked at Kaminari, who was looking much too pale just for blood loss. He licked the blade to the disgust of his packmates and found what he guessed was on it. He turned to Kaminari and he was lethargic. Izuku concentrated some viral cells in his hand and pushed them through modified pores on his skin to mimic Nem's quirk to aerosol his cells. The cells immediately were breathed in by Kaminari and he coughed. "Izuku, what are you doing?" Kirishima yelled out in a panic. He waved off the panicked looks on everyone's faces. "I'm pretty sure Kami was sick with whatever was on the blade. I don't get sick, so I had him take my cells so he wouldn't die or something. Also, there might be an experiment he wanted to see if he could do to negate a great weakness in himself." "What was on the axe?" "Poison," Toshi asked with a frown. Izuku shook his head. "Don't think so. I think it's a disease or sickness. Not entirely sure, but it got into Kami through blood." He pointed at the streak of blood on the blade. "Either way, he should be fine." Everyone turned to Kaminari, who was unconscious and breathing softly. "So he has your cells?" Shoji asked immediately. Izuku nodded. "Yep. with the basic function of destroying any diseases or things that would make him sick. They'll replicate and clean him until whatever was on the axe is gone. Couldn't you give that out in the real world to everyone to cure all diseases, cancers, and whatever else? Hagakure asked. She shrunk into herself slightly when Izuku turned his feral eyes on her. I thought about that, but I didn't think it was a good idea. Sure, it would cure everyone, but then my cells would take over their body a bit at a time. Worst case scenario, someone decides to use my super cure and turn it into a weapon of mass destruction. Which honestly seems easy to do. All you would need is someone who could manipulate quirks to work on my super cure to make it do things that would be classified as war crimes all around the world. He made the bunny ears in emphasis. While it would be great to spread a super cure, there would be too great of a risk of something happening. He emphasized his point by dropping a bead of blood on the sand. The red dot began to wriggle around, seeking nutrients that it would never find. What about my people you've helped? Ida stuttered. Like Cain, he quickly added. Izuku shrugged. No one knows, so it should be fine, probably, he said with a pause. As for my cells replacing his, it shouldn't have any adverse effects. After all, a person is that person because of their mind and memories, not their fleshy bits. Kirishima's eyebrows raised. Bro, that's deep. Yeah, how'd you come up with that? I mean, I agree, but... Zero trailed off. Kaken finished what Zero was going to say. You're not the most intellectual person, he said bluntly. Izuku looked offended and forced tears to crop up at the corners of his eyes. Are you calling me dumb? Mina was always close by, so she quickly jumped into the joke. She brought his head down and hugged him. How dare you call Aizu dumb? He's the smartest one here, she said as she stroked his hair. He does spend a lot of his time in his den, Toshi said blandly. He doesn't just lay around doing nothing, recalling all the times Izuku and he spent time chatting about inane things before UA. Sometimes about fun things like fictional stories and other times about physiological things like what Izuku just mentioned. Really? I always thought he sunned himself, like a lizard or something, Jairu said with a smirk. Well, that too, Toshi said, sharing the smirk with her.
Izuku mumbled.
It feels nice, he said pouting. Mina, having joined Izuku sunning himself more than once, had to agree. She let go of him and hooked his arm with hers. Well, what do we do with Sparky here? She motioned to the unconscious Kaminari. Izuku shrugged. Bed rest and food should be fine. I used most of my mass to heal him, but the blood loss and brief exposure to that infection wore him out. My cells should be wiping out all the impurities out of him as we speak. It'll be a while if it's taking all his impurities. Jairu snarked. They moved Kaminari into a bed and left him some water and food for him when he woke. Kuda decided to take the first shift of watching him just in case. While everyone got back to what they were doing, Izuku thought about the super cure he could create for his pack. While he did want to keep them safe and healthy, pumping his cells into them was a risk. What would happen to his cells if he died? Would they all die with him? What if someone could use his cells for something bad? Izuku pondered for a long time and no one bothered him. They could see he was deep in thought. Maybe an hour later, the feral boy decided. He would give them a choice. He trusted them and wanted them to stay healthy. He could easily make his cells follow the order to help eliminate any sickness or disease that entered their bodies, to work as an additive to their immune systems. After all, if he replaced their immune systems with his and something happened to him, they would be exposed to the weakest sicknesses. His cells would replicate only when it was needed and only stay where they should be. They would replace all the cells in their bodies like Kaminari's probably did. With his plan thought up, he leapt down from the roof he perched on and gathered his pack. He offered the super cure, as Hagakure called it, to anyone in his pack. He explained how it would be different and only stay with their immune systems. His cells would hover near their T cells to help their immune system. If they encountered something their immune system might not be able to handle, their cells would take over the job until the threat was gone. What about the risk? How you mentioned someone using your cells for a weapon? Shoji asked and all his pack nodded. Izuku shook his head. It's worth the risk, Gu said determinant. I would rather see you all as healthy as you can be. Oh, Hagakure cried out and hugged him. That's so sweet of you. The feral boy smiled and patted Hagakure's back as he returned the hug. Mina was right beside her as she squeezed him in her arms. After all the smiles and hugs were given, everyone agreed to try out the super cure, named by himself in the simulation. If something went wrong, then there wouldn't be any permanent damage. So, how are we going to do this? Shots like in a doctor's office, Toshi asked. Izuku hummed and snapped his fingers with a smile. I want to do it with a super move I probably won't use in the real world. Kaken narrowed his eyes at his old friend. Why not? Everyone circled Izuku as to his request. Too dangerous, it exposes everyone to my cells. Which is the purpose here, but not great out there. He was already shirtless, because why not? All he had to do was focus on the super move he only imagined using. Super move. Transmutative mists. Izuku's body ejected cells into the air through mimicry of Nem's quirk and spread to his packmates. They instinctively held their breaths but were reminded to breathe in the mist. It tasted and smelled odd, but they could complain as the cells began to integrate into their immune systems to cure all diseases. When it was done, the colorless mist disappeared. Everyone stood around Izuku and he beamed at them. They looked at each other but felt little to no different. Then again, when do you ever feel your immune system working? Izuku stepped forward and suddenly fell to his hands and knees. There was a panicked shout as Izuku never showed any kind of weakness before. Used too much energy? Too many cells at the same time? Sleepy. Nap time. Izuku mumbled to himself as his vision went in and out until his arms gave out. He fell face first into the sand and lay there unconscious for the first time in a decade. That wraps up Part 8, Legends. I hope you all enjoyed this wild ride. Remember to show some love to Big Teddy G3498 for this awesome collab. And of course, thank you for sticking with me and keeping this channel alive with your support. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Deku will face next? Hit that bell so you don't miss out on Part 9. See you soon, Legends, and keep being awesome.